There are a lot of reasons to fight. Not so honorable reasons like taking things or people by force for personal gain or pleasure. Honorable reasons like stopping people from doing that, like, defending your loved ones or your home or your friends, etc. Even if you have wildly different values, like even if you think fighting is often a good thing, actually, it's impossible to deny the destructive nature of it. Perhaps the worst reason of all to fight someone, though, is because your parents and their parents fought each other, and with no apparent end goal in mind, at least not one that they've had enduring success at. That's why the Blackwoods and Brackens do what they do, because they've always done it. From the outside, they think they have reasons, but from the outside, it kind of sort of looks like they just keep on fighting each other because it's what they've always done, like a tradition. Because they don't even seem to have a great grasp on how it all started or why they're fighting, right? So the whole point of it. A Song of Ice and Fire is full of cycles of violence, full past, full present, full in between. But no feud perhaps emulates the pointlessness of revenge, of mutually assured destruction, of what might be otherwise decent people at their worst than Bracken and Blackwood. What makes them keep doing it? How much have they harmed themselves over the years? How much have they held each other back and themselves back? And what are some of the standout moments of this feud over the eons? How badly and how often has their feud spread, as war often does, to engulf other houses, if not regions, if not entire kingdoms? Well, we've got the answer to all that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. I'm really working on my the little leading cast. Yeah, one day I'll be a master of that. For all the good it will do me and the rest of you. Hello and welcome, everybody. Another episode of History of Westeros podcast is here. Most Sundays we live stream at 3 Eastern, unless it's TV season, that means we'll be streaming on Mondays. Every video is on YouTube, and after editing, it's also on Spotify. The audio-only versions are available everywhere, but they're ad-free if you get them on Patreon, patreon.com/History of Westeros. Sean, how's it going today? I see you got a Dunkin' Egg shirt. I got a Bitter Steel shirt. I feel like the Blackwoods are more popular in the fandom, so I wanted to give the Brackens a little bit of a bump there.
You think the Blackwoods might be more popular in the fandom, eh? I'm not in a limb with that.
Yeah, I'm really going on a limb. Hey, I like a limb of a Blackwood tree by doing that. Yes, I'm not horsing around, when I say that.
My shirt is a minor clue to the trivia question today.
Oh, very good, very good. And shout out to our good friend Nina, goodqueenally.tumblr.com. The latest blog post over there is something she loves to talk about. It's she got a question about this one actually isn't a question. This is just her musing. Wondering about George and his use of Margaret of Anjou to Henry VI of England as inspiration for Maria Martell and Daron II. Daron II is going to come up today a little bit because we're talking about Blackfires and stuff. But yeah, George certainly has used a lot of the Henrys and English history and some French history as inspirations. Of course, the Accursed Kings is French and English history combined, and that's one of his favorite influences, and that's one of Nina's favorite things to write about. So you're going to want to read this one. Really good. She's excellent with the parallels in this period, or just in general, really. But this is, one of the topics she knows the best. So check it out. goodqueenally.tumblr.com. That's one L in alley. And if you have questions for us, well, send them to westeroshistory@gmail.com or put them in the live stream chat, and Ashea will often float them for us to discuss or answer. And I will and I will give you all some suggestions for episodes to further your immersion after the end of this one. Usually we focus on episodes that relate to this one, and that is no different here. Also, at the end of the episode will be the answer to this trivia question. What village rests between the grassy hills fought over by Bracken and Blackwood, known as the Teats? That means the hills are known as the Teats. What's the name of the village that sits between the Teats? It would be crazy to have a whole village between your Teats. Wow. You're a large person if you can do that. It's like Bender, right? Bender in Futurama.
I was gonna say, maybe it's a small village. Yeah.
We'll take an era-based approach today, looking at the interactions between the two houses in detail, then as a whole, sort of like all over, like an overview. Though their conflicts have the headline, we'll also look at the times they've fought, if not together, or at least on the same side, because it's pretty notable when bitter enemies are on the same side, and we're looking at an awful lot of history here. And of course, usually that's against some great common foe. But in between those common foes, they've torn each other apart so many times that they've often corrupted others around them into taking up that war with them. It's like a violence germ from Germ. That makes those times they fight on the same side all the more notable, right? And it really primes us as readers when we see Bracken and Blackwood, often, almost always, whenever they're in a sentence, they're next to each other. It immediately makes us think of this feud. It's so famous, so long running, and events are often framed by their feud. Like, oh, Bracken and Blackwood agreed? Oh my goodness, that's a big deal. Oh, Bracken and Blackwood, of course, they're on the opposite side. So many events throughout A Song of Ice and Fire and the history are framed through the Bracken-Blackwood feud, which I suspect some of you didn't realize it was quite this common in the story. But when you sit back and realize how much you've heard about this feud, it might make more sense and might start to register even more.
I remember a panel one time, I think at Ice and Fire Con, Lady Gwen from Radio Westeros.
From us.
Talked about how the lore within the world makes the world seem more believable. Does that make sense? If characters in the world know stories, and that makes us think of them as being more real people and relate to them, just like we in the real world have stories. Star Wars or Declaration of Independence or the Hatfields and McCoys.
Yes, good example. Yeah, I know our friend Scott Alexander, who's also a Facebook mod for our group, brought the Hatfields and McCoys up this week to me as a long-running feud. That's a good one. Yeah, that's a nice famous one. And you're right. Like we discussed the Hatfields and McCoys because they're a real-world rivalry, and in world, a lot of people talk about the Blackwood-Bracken rivalry because it's the most famous rivalry in Westeros, probably. And people that are nowhere near the Riverlands talk about it. It's like a thing. It's a matter of gossip, and it still gets used as a point of reference. Like, well, even the Blackens and Brackwoods would agree on that,
Yeah, and I was going to say it's among many literary devices that George uses. It becomes one that he can reference something that, as you said, that like when they do agree, characters in the book and us in the audience like, whoa, even they agree. It has more meaning.
Yeah, it's their feud gives emphasis by comparison to a lot of other things. It's kind of what I was getting with the filtered through their view. Yeah, it's really interesting how George uses this because they're not just a great piece of world building, as you say, as Lady Gwyn said. It's also a really powerful narrative device. George uses them to convey information really effectively, and we're going to have a lot of examples of that. One thing we love to do on our show, a recurring feature, one of our regular approaches, is to take a look at the first time something is mentioned. We call it the first mention. Haha, of course. How simple of us, but how effective. Here is the first mention of Bracken and Blackwood feud. Catelyn 5, A Game of Thrones.
The rain obscured the fields beyond the crossroads, but Catelyn saw the land clear enough in her memory. The marketplace was just across the way, and the village a mile farther on, 100 white cottages surrounding a small stone sept. There would be more now. The summer had been long and peaceful. North of here, the King's Road ran along the green fork of the Trident, through fertile valleys and green woodlands, past thriving towns and stout holdfasts and the castles of the river lords. Catelyn knew them all, the Blackwoods and the Brackens, ever enemies, whose quarrels her father was obliged to settle.
Yep, and then of course the quote goes on to mention other Riverlands houses and different, like a one-liner about each of them. But here we go. The first time they're mentioned together in the context of their feud. They're introduced as enemies and neighbors under her father's vassal, or as her father's vassals. And it's going to come up pretty big later in this episode because we're going to go back in time to talk with history and then finish with A Song of Ice and Fire, finish with main book events. And you'll be surprised at some of the times that Bracken and Blackwood come up as the backdrop to a greater event. You'll also notice that whenever there's a list of houses or lords that include them both, like a list of Riverlords' houses, Bracken and Blackwood are all but like once or twice in the entire series. I looked for this because, that's the kind of thing I do. They're always next to each other. Like, there are a couple of exceptions, but very few. And I think it's partly because of alliteration. Bracken, Blackwood, they're BRBL, BRA, actually, BLA. Like, actually, yeah, like that's really close. The fourth letter is a C in both words also. Like, they fit together.
2 syllables, it flows off the tongue.
Yeah.
And they are geographically right next to each other also.
Yeah.
So they would be lumped together for that reason. But also because they're so tied to each other, any time you would be listing them, you need to be accounting for them. Does that make sense?
Yes.
If you're listing your allies, you have to name the 2 of them together because they might cancel each other out.
Yeah. It's always a problem. There's always a little extra baggage with them. Yeah. Bracken, Blackwood, baggage. Yes.
Yeah, whether they're allies or obstacles or whatever it is, they kind of are coming together. Even if they aren't working together, you have to consider them together.
Let's use a modern social media phrase to get us started a little further here. How it started versus how it's going. This is a bit of an overview of, how it started versus how it's going for Bracken and Blackwood. Quote.
The feud of the Blackwoods and Brackens is infamous, and rightly so, for it stretches back thousands of years to before the coming of the Andals. The origins of it are contested and shrouded in legend. The Blackwoods say they were kings, and the Brackens little more than petty lords set on betraying and deposing them, while the Brackens say much the same about the Blackwoods. That they were both royal houses on the Trident seems true enough, and none can doubt that their enmity sprang from some cause so entrenched that it has become legendary. Powerful as they were, they have maintained their feud despite the many kings who have attempted to make a peace between them.
I like how that kind of throws a little shade on. It was like, their enmity sprang from some cause. Like, it had to come from somewhere. It's not nothing. But they're still downplaying that it should have any value now, thousands of years later. Whatever that cause was, there's no way it's so bad that y'all still need to be fighting over it this far later. Like, many royal houses have been overthrown by many vassals, and none of them are still hating each other thousands of years later. I mean, there's certainly something flare-ups here and there, but this is truly exceptional in that this not only is the cause not known, there's nothing you can imagine that would make it right. Like, it wouldn't justify this, for either of them. So
the thing that might make it justifiable is also the thing that might have ended it.
Yeah.
A red wedding type scenario, right?
Sure.
Like if the Brackens had slaughtered every man, woman, and child, then there would be reason for this feud, but there would be no one left to have the feud anymore.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
exactly. Yeah, it's like one of the things you can do to end a feud is completely wipe out the enemy, but neither house has ever been powerful enough to do that to the other. There's a lot of real world nations that are kind of like that. They'd love to wipe each other out, but they can't, and some of these feuds go back thousands of years as well, or maybe happened thousands of years and are not happening anymore. But I
wonder too,
that's not unrealistic.
I wonder how much it's purely they weren't powerful enough. If there could be some other factor, if as bad as the feud is, maybe, this 30-year-old warrior who's upset because of what their dad did to his uncle, and he wants revenge, and he goes to kill the other 30-year-old warrior, but there's his wife and his 2-year-old child in the room. Is he that merciless to slaughter them too, or does he let them live? But then now that child grows up having the same vendetta.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a lack of power or a lack of a positive thing? Maybe a lack of ruthlessness.
There's still some honor and chivalry mixed into it, even though they're bitter. And that's a really interesting concept that you raise here, Sean, because very often we see Bracken do to Blackwood or Blackwood do to Bracken what they pretty much wouldn't do to anyone else. Maybe not go quite so far as to slaughter a 2-year-old, though there are some examples of that even. But it's the thing where it's like they would never do this. It's like it's beyond their normal boundaries of honor unless it's Bracken or Black, unless it's this bitter enemy from thousands of years ago. So
and there's also not quite as much at stake. Like Tywin killed all the tried to kill all the Targaryen children.
Yeah.
But that was for, ostensibly, right, the safety of the realm. He's got to make sure this new king is in place and he's aligned with them and the war is over. And that if he lets Targaryens get away, that might be in jeopardy. But this is just over. It might be harder to justify when there's less to win. Like, maybe if you thought you killed the last Bracken, you would get credit from your house for ending the feud. But this 1-2-year-old, they're not the last one. There's still a bunch of cousins. I don't know how many times someone might have gone through that and made what seemed like a good decision, but ended up continuing the feud.
And like we'll see later in the episode as well, it's impossible to kill everyone with Blackwood blood without killing some Brackens.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Or vice versa. Like they've mixed so many times, and they've mixed with other houses that have mixed with them. Yeah, they're all so intermarried and so connected by now. It's just So they both. What's interesting too is they both disagree on what the initial cause was. They both have a reason that is their cause. It's not a good reason, as we've said, because there's so many other examples of houses that have done this exact same thing to each other, yet they don't have lifelong enmity. But the histories don't even necessarily agree with either of their versions of events. So it's like they have a personalized version of history. It's like, no, this is our history. It's like, no, there's fact and fiction and then our version. And we just go with that because what we do. So as you said earlier, Sean, proximity is a big deal. Proximity plays a role, as it often does. It's hard to maintain a long feud with someone that lives thousands of miles away. But if they're your neighbor, it's a lot easier to understand. You can argue over little things like, well, this fence is too far on my side. Like things that regular neighbors around the world would argue about. Hopefully they don't turn to violence, but we know that sometimes they do. And if the story that the Blackwoods started in the north is true, then the Starks forcing them south was a pretty crucial beginning because clearly they would not have been neighbors to the Brackens had that not happened in the first place. Nina adds, and of course, the history of the Riverlands as a geopolitical region encourages this sort of conflict. The Riverlands has always been war-torn, right? They don't have one house that has held power for a really long time, like the Starks have in the north, the Lannisters have in the west, the Aarons have in the Vale, the Durrandon/Baratheons have in the Storm, etc. Right? There's a marked lack of stability in the Riverlands as to the dominant royal house as compared to all the other regions. Even the Ironborn have had more stability there, and they've had less than some of the others, but they've had more stability at the top than even the Riverlands have. Of course, that's partly because of the Ironborn and the Stormlands and some other houses that have given the Riverlands a lack of stability through invasions, but they've done a plenty good job of fighting each other in between all that.
As the Ironborn have their fair share of feuds and have held themselves back with such, so.
Yeah. So it's a little odd on some surface that both Bracken and Blackwood claim that they're the rightful kings because they don't do that anymore. Yet they're still mad at the other house for undoing their kingdom that they probably rose and fell several times, right? These flare-ups often start over little things. Like imagine my miniature example of like a neighbor arguing over where a fence is. That in the real world, that often just goes to like court or something like that. It gets resolved by a third party. It doesn't usually fall to violence. Maybe if you go back a couple hundred years, it would more often result in violence. And maybe some of those times it resulted in long-term violence. Hatfields and McCoys, a good example. I don't think their dispute started over a fence. I don't remember what it started over. Do you, Sean?
For what it's worth, it started over. They lived on opposite sides of a river in West Virginia and Kentucky.
Yeah,
and they both had family members that fought in the Civil War, all for the Confederates except one. I forgot what side he was on, but did fight for the North. And we came back. The other family killed him.
Oh,
so that's what initiated. But even that might have subsided, except like the next incursion or whatever was. A dispute over who owned a pig.
Oh my God!
Which led to a murder, which and
talk about small
maybe
stakes.
That initial thing was sort of justified, but future things were not. But it had started. Anything was going to cause it now.
They both had a long list of prior grievances built up from that initial conflict spawned more conflicts, and then the list was really long, and they may not have even remembered how it started. Like some of them individually, like historians may have pieced it all together later, but yeah. So that's often how some of these flare-ups came up, and like they maybe had a big deal for the first one, like someone overthrowing the other one from their kingdom, from losing their crown. But from then on, mostly it's smaller things, just a pig or the teats or something small like that, right? Now, what's funny about this is, despite their proximity, them being neighbors, we're not 100% sure about either the location of Stonehenge or Raventree Hall. We just know that they're next to each other, and Raventree is north of the Red Fork and Stonehenge is south of it. But they've got, sometimes the Brackens have had land on the other side and vice versa, and probably at times they've both held lands on the other side of the Red Fork. And we know that because there's been so many border disputes that don't involve the river, right? This mill, they've argued over. Well, if it was just a matter of one being on one side of the river or the other, that would be pretty easy. So, well, it's on our side of the river. How could you even... I mean, they'd still find a way to fight over that, but it'd be really easy to adjudicate from the river and be like, that's on this side of the river. That's easy. Clearly, it's not that simple, though, because these disputes aren't about just north or south of the Red Fork. Let's take a look at the map. You can see the surrounding area. It gives you a general idea. You got River Run a little bit to the west there. These areas that we've seen quite a bit in the books, they've been traversed by Jaime and Arya and Brienne, in and out. Like some of these ranges, and the BWB, we don't always see them, on page, but they're there. You can't always see them, but they're there. And so that's like some of these areas, we can't point to exactly where, but some of the ones along the river, some of the ones that are close to the other side, whichever perspective you're looking at it from, whether Bracken or Blackwood side, they're like the disputed lands in Essos. So Bracken and Blackwood have fought over these many times. They're not constantly at war, but they're probably only a pig away from starting up a fight again over just a mill or a village or some hives, some beehives. We even see Jaime and Titus Blackwood talking about that specific thing. He's like, you got to give some land up. He's like, all right, I'll give this to that and that, and it's like, give him the beehives. It'll make his teeth rot. It's like he's trying to find some silver lining in this, like anything to get those Brackens. Like, yeah, I'll make their teeth rot. That's it. Yeah, that's it. Sure, Titos, that's going to happen. Yeah. So there's several examples of them fighting or taking that dispute to the king and trying to get, which you prefer them to do if you're going to have a dispute. Like, yeah, go to an adjudicator. Don't just start drawing your swords and killing each other. But quite often that is what happened.
Real quick, I want to point out that it makes me a little more certain that George had the Hatfield and McCoys in mind when he made this feud, because they lived on opposite sides of a river called the Tug Fork.
The Tug Fork. Oh, instead of the Red Fork. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
That's really good. That is really good. So we'll see some examples throughout the rest of the episode of specific pieces of land. The Teats is probably the most famous. It's been owned by both Blackwood and Bracken countless times and given back to the other. Lost it, owned it, lost it. It's like, who knows how many times these Teats have passed back. And why can't one have the left teat and the other have the right? Why can't they just share the Teats? Yeah, those Teats really stick out. So let's talk about the different versions. Let's have a quote from each side. This is Jaime being told this bit by Lord Jonas Bracken.
If I may offer you some counsel, though, it does not serve to be too gentle with those Blackwoods. Treachery runs in their blood. Before the Andals came to Westeros, House Bracken ruled this river. We were kings, and the Blackwoods were our vassals, but they betrayed us and usurped the crown. Every Blackwood is born a turncloak. You would do well to remember that when you were making terms.
It sounds like what all of Westeros thinks about bastards. Like, they're all treacherous. It's ridiculous. That in that context, and it's ridiculous here too. Every Blackwood is born a that's insane, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And who would believe that? Like, Jaime's like, oh, you don't say. Okay, I will be careful. I will treat them all as turncloaks. Thanks for the advice, Lord Jonas. Like, he doesn't realize how silly he sounds, But I mean, that kind of talk isn't that strange for Westeros. But when you really put it under the microscope, it's like, it's pretty ridiculous. But he's sincere. He's utterly sincere. That's how entrenched in, like, how much a part of their identity this hatred for the other side is.
That's the word I wanted to use, is identity. I was going to bring that up earlier. It's that even when something about you is negative, when it is your identity, you still live up to it and talk about it, maybe even brag about it. You know, like, I'm not good at math. That's something that once you feel that about yourself, whether it's even true or not, you stick to it. You know? So it maybe even justifies some of your actions. You want to make sure people know about it so they know what to expect from you. You never decide, I'm going to get good at math now, right? That's your identity. I'm not good at math. Don't expect me to do this. I'm going to make sure everyone knows I'm not going to do math, you know?
There are, I mean, that's a theme in A Song of Ice and Fire in several places, right? Like, you know, a woman's courtesy is her armor, and Tyrion says, you know, the world won't forget that you're a bastard, so own it. Or House Cod saying, though all men may despise us, like, yep, they all hate us, but that's who we are. You know, we're gonna own it. Yeah, that comes up a lot. You're right. Good point, Sean. So yeah, so he's utterly sincere. He believes what he's saying. And it's again, it comes back to these things that you wouldn't do this to another person, but you might do it for your child. This is a theme in the real world. It's a theme that George really amplifies a lot, I think, where people of honor, there's things they won't do for themselves. They will break personal codes, do things they think might look evil in another context, but to them, since they're doing it for their children, it's not evil. It's the reverse sort of thing here. Like, what a Bracken would do to a Blackwood is not what they would do to somebody else. Their view, they don't see them as human. They don't see them as the same species. Almost, it's strange that way. This is how hate corrupts your brain.
And that's also part of the tragedy here, is that identity that they have, like, we hate the Brackens and we hate the Blackwoods, they pass that on to their children.
Yes.
Their children wouldn't think that if their parents didn't tell them.
Yeah, right? From a very early age, like blah, 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 honor, blah, blah, except for those dirty Blackwoods, you know?
And make sure their children also take on that identity.
Yeah, it's important for them. It's like, yeah, he hates the Blackwoods like a good little Bracken should, you know? Or the other way around. He's like, does he hate them? How much does he hate the Bracken? A lot. They're like, oh, okay, good.
You know, it might be, it's one thing if you don't think you're good at math and forget about trying. But can you imagine telling your child you're not good at math?
At 2 years old.
With this in school because you're not good at it. That's who we are. We are not, you know what I mean? Like, that's to pass on to your child. And this is arguably even more awful, you know? To pass on the prejudice, you know?
Zach Remley sends a super chat, says, History of Westeros is the best podcast on Earth. Can't wait for season 2 coverage. Well, thank you, Zach. We will try to live up to that great praise.
Yeah, we're trying to break into the Mars market.
Yeah, that's a tough one. There's not very many listeners there. So thankfully, Jamie is curious enough to delve deeper into this Blackwood Bracken history, but not by asking Lord Jonas for more. He's like, well, I don't need you as a source. Let me ask someone who's got a little more of a neutral view, or at least an opposing view. Let me hear from a Blackwood, which is exactly what happens. Here's a quote from that same chapter.
How did all this begin between Blackwood and Bracken? Is it written down?
It is, my lord, the boy said. But some of the histories were penned by their maesters and some by ours, centuries after the events that they purport to chronicle. It goes back to the age of heroes. The Blackwoods were kings in those days. The Brackens were petty lords, renowned for breeding horses. Rather than pay their king his just due, they used the gold their horses brought them to hire swords and cast him down.
I want to point out this is a smart boy,
and
maybe even gets credit for being wise and courageous. To have this knowledge, to have researched this out, then to understand that there are differences in the histories, and that could be meaningful. And then to say it out loud, right? Like, what they didn't know, but to point out, I don't know, but, maybe he's just naive. Maybe he's just too young to realize that his family might not be happy with this. But I want to give him some credit here.
I agree. And remember, Jamie thinks like Tyrion would love this kid. Like, they would just talk about history and all that. But he definitely is naive. Like, Jamie notices, like, this kid thinks he's going on some grand adventure here. And he's also like, should be wary of the fact that his father was like, this is the one his father chose to get rid of. Like, he doesn't realize that. Like, he's like, no, I want to keep my daughter. He was stricken. That was the actual word. When Jamie asked for his daughter, he's like, he looked stricken. He's like, well, Bethany, like, can you take someone else maybe, you know? And that's often not what you see, right? Like, lords often aren't, they're willing to give up their daughters, like, in part because that's what they expect to do in the long term anyway. Like, I'm going to marry her to some other house anyway. So, but they're also people and they grow attached to their children, but some more than others in some cases. So, this story about one of them being king throwing the other down, or vice versa, they both have these stories that seem to contradict each other, but they don't actually have to contradict each other. We're talking about a lot of history. One could have ruled over the other for a time, only to lose their crown to the other, only to regain it later, to lose it again to them or the other, or in between, or they could have both been kings at the same time. Like, it could have been a king of Blackwood Vale and a king over Stonehenge at the same time, and they could have warred against each other. Like, all these stories could be true. None of them could be true. There's enough time that passed that enables so many possibilities. And given that they don't even know which is true, I mean, that's where I fall down. Like, who knows which one is first? And that's the point. I don't think George isn't going to reveal that, because that would give one side more justification, maybe. Not much.
If he did reveal it, I bet I would want him to reveal it for the Bracken.
Yeah.
I would want to know if everyone were like, oh, maybe they're right. But the thing is, that doesn't make them right.
It doesn't make them right. Yeah.
Something that happened thousands of years ago, no. Even the statement, by the way, in that quote, when he says, goes back to the age of heroes, the Blackwoods were kings in those days, the Brackens petty lords. Well, how long was the age of heroes?
So long.
Like, right? They both could have been kings or petty lords in that. Like, it would be like if you're talking about the 17 and 1800s. You could say the United States wasn't united in that era. Or you could say the United States was united in that era. Those would both be true statements. So,
yeah. And it's also possible that, I mean, we're also have every reason to believe that a lot of this comes back to before the Andal times. Like, they were both probably neighbors or well before the Andals, and that's before there was any written history. So they're admitting that this feud goes back to a time where no one has records. Maybe Bran can look back and it's like, that's what he wants to do. He's like, I want to go find out when this started. I don't care about the others. I don't care about anything else. I want to know how this. Yeah,
that's his ulterior motive to all this.
He could have already known by now. He's like, no, I looked deep and I need a more powerful green seer to look back farther. I couldn't do it. So yeah, the fog of history just allows so many possibilities, allows for all these stories to be true, etc. And yeah, and Nina kind of says a similar thing, Sean, like, probably the Brackens were there first. That doesn't mean that their story is right or that it justifies anything. Like, she agrees with that. But given that the Blackwoods probably started in the north, that argues that maybe the Brackens had gotten to the Riverlands first and the Blackwoods came later. But even that is not a sure thing, because for all we know, the Blackwoods are 500 years older than the Brackens as a house, you know, or even longer, or the other way around. Like the Long Night, right? They could have been allies during the Long Night. This is a good example of, well, even sometimes Bracken and Blackwood fight on the same side. And it's when there's an overwhelming common threat that when that happens. And that, of course, is way far back. And I have to use descriptive words like way with lots of Y's, because we have no idea how many actual years it's talking about. It's even hard to guesstimate. Jamie and Hoster Blackwood's conversation continues a bit further, which helps set the stage for more discussion. Quote,
when did all this happen?
500 years before the Andals. 1,000 if the true history is to be believed. Only no one knows when the Andals crossed the narrow sea. The true history says 4,000 years have passed since then, but some maesters claim that it was only 2. Past a certain point, all the dates grow hazy and confused, and the clarity of history becomes the fog of legend.
Well, that kid really is a little historian, isn't he?
Right.
I like him. So, to frame this, basically to summarize, no one knows. They literally don't know how it started. But they do know how it's going, because it's still going. And it's a lot of fighting and feuding and blood. And it's like what Tyrion said, we dance to the tune of those who came before us. They inherited this grudge. It's passed down to them, but they don't question it seemingly or much at all. You know, maybe someone like Hoster Blackwood does, but he's an academic. He's not going to be the one to get out there and force them to stop, which might be what it takes. You might need someone stronger to keep them in line, which is the only time it's ever stopped them, was someone more powerful. And like, look at Stark and Bolton. Like, there's the enmity between Stark and Bolton isn't this great. You know, there is some enmity, and it's particularly strong right now given recent events. But it had died down for hundreds of years, right? I don't think Blackwood Bracken ever took that long of a break. Maybe Dorne and the Marcher Lords had the longest running similar feud. That isn't one house, but certain border pairings, like, I don't know, the Stoneway, the Fowlers, and the Tarleys, are opposite ends of that of the Stoneway. So maybe that, or the Princess Pass rather. So maybe that's it. I don't know. But it's hard to come up with examples that are even close to Bracken and Blackwood as far as rivalries. And there's healthy debate rooted in the timeline there, so we can't be too sure of much of anything. But however long the timeline truly is, whether it's 2,000 years, 4,000 years, 8,000 years, the Brackens have been at it that whole time. However long it is, they fit that to there. So the sheer longevity of the feud is special in itself. Let's jump forward to the Age of Heroes and talk a bit about how things progressed from there. Quote.
Stretching from the neck to the banks of the Blackwater and east to the borders of the Vale, the Riverlands are the beating heart of Westeros. No other land in the Seven Kingdoms has seen so many battles, nor so many petty kings and royal houses rising and falling.
With a quote like that, it becomes even more ridiculous to see the Bracken Blackwood dispute. Like, so many other people have fought and killed and died and usurped and overthrown and betrayed, but they really are focused on each other. It's like no one ever harmed us as badly as they did all those thousands of years ago in ways we can't describe. And as we see, like, this pattern is still continuing. Robb's new kingdom during the events of A Song of Ice and Fire happened, and fell, or is still kind of maybe not completely fallen, but arguably has fallen. We'll see. Either way, it's an example of what he's saying here. No other land in the Seven Kingdoms has seen so many battles, nor so many petty kings and royal houses rising and falling. So yeah, we see it literally during the events of A Song of Ice and Fire. But it's likely at its worst the farther back we go, when there were smaller kingdoms, there was more fighting, there were more borders, more disputes, etc. And that's probably when whatever transpired between Bracken and Blackwood really truly started and got established. So during this very foggy time of history that we know very little about, we'll just say there was a long night. Bracken and Blackwood most likely fought on the same side, perhaps for the first time ever. Maybe. And fast forward many years later, when there was another common foe and a whole new historical era, the Andal Kings. Now, the Andals, of course, didn't come all at once. It wasn't just one giant invasion of Andals. It was waves of migrations and expeditions and comings and goings and risings and fallings. One battle in particular, though, stands out for our purposes with this episode.
The Great Battle of Bitter River, where the Brackens of Stonehenge and the Blackwoods of Raventree Hall made common cause against the invaders, only to be shattered by the charge of 777 Andal knights and 7 septons, bearing the 7-pointed star of the faith upon their shields.
Yeah, the Andals, for the most part, didn't replace existing houses, right? They suborned existing power structures. Like, well, why create a new house when I could just become the new Lord Blackwood or new Lord Bracken, which has power in this realm. People respect that name already. That comes along with the feud, but still, it has other baggage with it. But for the most part, it's better than starting fresh, for the most part. So this provided a new wedge for the two houses as well, because yes, they stood together in this battle, but as things played out afterwards, it created a new reason for them to have a dispute. It may have really refreshed their rivalry, because most houses in the Riverlands took the 7, including the Brackens, but the Blackwoods did not. So now they're also different religions. So that's always a recipe, or not always, often a recipe for disputes. And it's certainly something that can inflame an existing dispute. Two religions that can get along, but when two people already hate each other and they have different religions, when they used to have the same one, well, I think most people would bet on things getting worse. And indeed they did.
You got to wonder what cause and effect here is, too. Did they choose different religions and so the rivalry got greater, or because the rivalry was so great they chose different religions?
Yeah.
If you're gonna join, I'm not gonna be in that group if they are, so.
We see that so often, that if one of them does something the other won't, just on general principle. If they're doing it, we're not, or if they aren't doing it, we will. So absolutely, the Blackwood stubbornness might be a combination of piety and conservatism, or just tradition or whatever. But it might be, we're not switching if the Brackens are, or the other way around. And certainly you can see why it would inflame things further because, well, the old gods isn't dogmatic. They're not really out there trying to win converts. They're not out. That's not really how it works. They don't even have priests, right? People either choose to worship it or they don't. And the reason it started is because there was proof of it being real thousands of years ago. But the Seven is more like a real world religion where there's people are trying to convert people to it. It's a problem if you don't follow our religion. So there was definitely burning of heart trees and during this era, and destruction of other things associated with the old gods and worship of that. So that would certainly cause lots of problems for Blackwoods who were trying to not let that happen versus Brackens who are maybe at the forefront of that because it enables them to target the Blackwoods and maybe their allies. So definitely a tip of the spear, the kind of thing that starts more fights. For example, Tytos Blackwood tells Jaime that the Raven Tree Heart Tree was killed by the Brackens. He says they poisoned it, quote, 1,000 years ago. The generic 1,000 years ago. And he blames the Brackens. But I wouldn't be surprised if they did not do that, if it just died for some other reason, someone else poisoned it, but I also wouldn't be surprised if they did. It's like, they very well might have, So, yeah. This is like, you can't really use like motivation as a guide here. It's like, his motivation is their motivation is to destroy Blackwoods, but their motivation is to blame Brackens. So it goes both ways.
That generic 1,000 years too, that could be 700 years or 2,000 years, but it's so long ago, you can't prove me wrong.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's true. A lot of those like it's not appeal to authority, it's appeal to ancientism.
Yeah.
Appeal to the fog of history.
Part of our identity. It's been that way 1,000 years. That's what we believe. It's not going to change.
Who are you to question it? It's been this way this long. You're going to question your fathers and their fathers, and they're like, no, that's the reverence for their elders, their long dead elders, is plays a role in upholding these traditions, I think, too. But almost as if to show us what Bracken and Blackwood are capable of if they work together. In addition to that case where they lost to the Andals, there's some times where it actually, went better. Hoster Blackwood tells us the two houses intermarried many times to forge a peace. But we know nothing of the success or lack thereof or any of these marriages. That's not true. Not nothing. We have a few examples. And here's one of them. This next one is, there was at least attraction, if not love, between Bracken and Blackwood. Quote.
The first of the Andal kings to bring all the Riverlands under his sway was a bastard born of a tryst between two ancient enemies, the Blackwoods and the Brackens. As a boy, he was Benedict Rivers, despised by all, but he grew to be the greatest warrior of his age, Ser Benedict the Bold. His prowess in battle won him the support of both his mother's house and his father's, and soon other river lords bent their knees to him as well.
There's nothing like being a total badass as a means to dominate a culture that loves total badasses. Like, they respect it, and there's the actual "I'll kill you if you don't obey me" aspect to it that is always sort of looming, like Aegon the Conqueror. Like, don't forget, I have Balerion. Now, this guy obviously has nothing like a Balerion, but being the greatest warrior of your age carries a lot of weight. Just before you even get on the battlefield, people are already afraid of you when you have things like that going. and that makes them more likely to just sign up to be on your side. Like, I'd rather be on the side of the baddest warrior than be against him, you know? Sometimes you want to be the guy that beats the baddest warrior. But it's a huge deal here that the two houses seem to work together to subjugate the Riverlands for the man who descended from both houses. We don't have another example like this of Bracken and Blackwood being combined in one person that was so effective. It might be an exception to the claim that, yes, they sometimes work together to fight a common foe, but not just them. They join coalitions that involve other river lords and all that. Never it's like just Bracken and Blackwood, just the two of them together. That's unheard of. Except maybe here. Maybe Benedict the Bold is the only example of otherwise. So I like to think that he had a sigil that had both houses kind of reflected, like a quartering of both. But eventually he took his own name because he became so famous and founded a dynasty, which is House Justman. And they had scales as their sigil. So there's no remnant of either Bracken or Blackwood in that sigil.
Scales like dragon scales?
No, justice. The scales of justice.
Oh, gotcha.
Like Justman. Yeah, he's House Justman. Yeah, I'm just man. Like Saul Goodman. How Benedict Justman.
Oh, just man.
Yeah, exactly. And this is maybe the closest it ever gets to being a powerful, functional, united state before the conquest. The petty divisions, though, is what kept that from happening. It's heavily implied, if not stated outright, that the reason the Riverlands never had one house at the top that could hang and keep stability for so long is directly related to these feuds between them, and of which Bracken Blackwood is the biggest by far. So yes, every time they go to war, it often engulfs the other houses around them because they have allies, and then those allies have to go to war, and then they've all just wrecked each other and progress, blah, blah, blah. After about 300 years, though, the kingdom of the Justmans fell apart, the dynasty collapsed, and here's what happened next. Quote,
"Another period of anarchy and bloodshed followed. The realm that Benedict the Bold had knitted together was torn asunder once again, and 100 years of conflict saw petty kings from the houses Blackwood, Bracken, Vance, Mallister, and Charlton contending with one another for supremacy."
That was the Ironborn that tore it apart, right? That's what that was.
No, that's about to be. It's going to be. They come next, but they.
Is there not some certain onus that made it Justman's reign?
No, it just there. Yeah, there was a collapse, but it's not really. It's not related to Bracken Blackwood, but yeah, the Ironborn invasion comes a bit later. So they. Unlikely, or not unlikely, rather, that both of them held crowns again during this short anarchy period. And then they would have lived as vassals under someone else, or maybe back and forth. It's very chaotic, and there's not a lot of tracking of this period.
When you say held crowns again, they both would have claimed to be kings again of smaller lands, most likely, right?
Right.
So, because that's something I was wondering about, is under his rule, did they? They would have maintained their own houses and had their own sigils and their own marriages and everything. Like Justin became a whole new house. It kind of just came and went, right? And Bracken and Blackwood just existed simultaneously, continuously alongside of that. And it went away, and they were just back to where they were before.
Like usually, you have something like a cadet branch forms out of a former house, but in this case, it's like a cadet branch from two houses. Like it's equally, you could say it was equally
like a parent
formed.
Branch formed.
yeah, a lot like that. So because usually a bastard is only, a lot of times they're only noble on one side, or they just go with their father's side or something like that. But this, because of the unique situation here, because Bracken and Blackwood are both so powerful, and I mean, honestly, it sounds like a bit of a Romeo and Juliet thing, doesn't it? Like this tryst between a Bracken and a Blackwood. Like it doesn't even say which was the mother and which was the father, because maybe that's not important. It's not really that important, but it might add some detail if we knew, which side did which, but probably that wouldn't change things very much at all. because he might favor one over the other, because people usually favor your father's house just in Westeros because it's so patriarchal. But there's no indication of that here, probably because he needed to keep that balance. If he favors Bracken, the Blackwoods will get pissed. If he favors part of managing his vassals is keeping them from fighting each other, as so many other overlords of the Riverlands had to deal with these two houses fighting each other. He was uniquely positioned to hold them together because he came from both of their houses, so that made it harder to argue favoritism and things like that. Plus, he was also just a really strong guy, and they didn't want to mess with him. So all those ingredients really lined up well.
Another sort of follow-up question. I did a little research, but couldn't find anything too definitive. It seems weird to me that this house got to such supremacy and then just completely disappeared. I got no lost cousin or anything. There's one guy, Lucifer, came about and made a claim, right?
Yeah.
But is there anything beyond that?
No. They basically died out. Like, there's a lot of Riverlands houses that went that way, like House Mud and House Fisher and some others that you don't see those type of extinctions as often in the other regions for the very same reason the Riverlands is so war-torn. That lack of stability is why you see royal houses go extinct, whereas in other places it wouldn't necessarily, or where they cease to be royal houses, or where there's so much changing at the top. So, yeah, I can imagine, this is also the era of sigils and banners and all that, and house words, house mottos, because the first men didn't do that. So when the Tullys came up with family, duty, honor, I believe the Brackens and Blackwoods were like, okay, that's pretty good, but let's do it a little differently. Let's go. My family duty, the family to kill is the Blackwoods. I have a duty to kill Blackwoods. It is honorable to kill Blackwoods. And the Blackwood house words would be kill Brackens, family, duty, honor, in that order. Yeah, they both would have it. And we actually don't know the words for either house, so we can play with that all we want. So the Riverlands lost their self-rule after that period of anarchy too, because the Stormlands eventually took the Riverlands, and it was after the Brackens and Blackwoods actually fought together again against House Teague. The Teagues were the final Riverlands-bred dynasty to rule the Riverlands. But they were very zealous with their religion, to the point that even the Brackens thought they had gone too far. So the Blackwoods rose against them because they're like, hey, we worship the old gods, so your zealotry is a particular problem for us. But rather than the Brackens saying, we worship the seven, perfect opportunity to attack the Blackwoods, they actually joined the Blackwoods. So this was a very rare case. And now other Riverland houses did too, so it's not a case of just being Blackwood and Bracken. There were a lot of, like, the Vances and some other houses joined in. But they were going to lose. This coalition of rebels was going to lose to the Teagues until the Blackwoods brought their in-laws, the Durrandons, in. Almost called them the Baratheons, but we're well before that era. The Durrandons come in, beat the Teagues, and then they were going to hand the Riverlands over to the Blackwoods, but the Blackwood who was going to receive the crown died during the war, and they're like, well, we could hand it to, like, his daughter or sister. We're not sure who she was. It was Shiera Blackwood, and they're like, nah, let's not do that. Let's just keep it. So the Storm Kings just, so they held it. And they held it for a while, 300 years. You got to believe that the Stormlanders were like, every few years, every 10 years, 20 years, like, God, those Brackens and Blackwoods are at it again. Like, this is why no one wants to rule this region. These two houses make it just not worth it. It's such a hassle. And I don't know if the Stormlander, who knows how they ruled it? Did they encourage them to fight each other? Because the next group of overlords, the Ironborn, will encourage that. They're like, you go right ahead and fight each other. But I suspect they were a little unusual in that. I suspect that most rulers want their vassals not so united that they're a danger of gathering together and overthrowing you, but not so at war that they're not so hating each other that they're fighting each other, because then your tax revenue is less and you're... Yeah.
What value are they to you? You can't call them up to fight for you because they're fighting with each other.
Yeah.
And you're contributing to the coffers or helping their own people or anything.
So surely there were flare-ups. We just don't know what they were. And the 300 years of Storm Kings holding the Riverlands. But interestingly, the fall of the Storm King's rule over the Riverlands and transitioning to the Ironborn actually was in part because of the Bracken-Blackwood feud yet again. Let's start, rather than let's skip all the campaign and just get to the decisive battle. Quote.
Lord Tully abandoned River Run without a fight, fleeing with all his strength to join the host gathering at Raventree Hall under Lady Agnes Blackwood and her sons. But when Lady Agnes advanced upon the Ironborn, her belligerent neighbor, Lord Lothar Bracken, fell upon her rear with all his strength and put her men to flight. Lady Agnes herself and 2 of her sons were captured and delivered to King Harwin, who forced the mother to watch as he strangled her boys with his bare hands.
So the reason I wanted to include that last line, which isn't actually relevant to the Bracken-Blackwood conflict, is, well, I think it is, because look at this bad judgment. Like, this is who Lothar Bracken allied with, this guy that strangled this woman's sons in front of her. Like, this is the man you think you can trust, that you want as your like, what were you thinking? And indeed, it was a huge mistake. He would later regret turning on his fellow Riverlanders. And it seems like kind of obvious, that like a blatant mistake. And I think that maybe just a dummy, but I think it was, an opportunity to attack the Blackwoods. I think he just took that part of it and focused on that and was like, all right, here's our chance. And that was maybe too much of a benefit to him and clouded his judgment on how bad the rest of this arrangement would be. I also wonder if Lady Agnes just hated the Brackens even more than King Harwin. I was like, yeah, he killed my sons in front of me, but that Bracken's the reason this is even happening in the first place. He betrayed the entire Riverlands, like that guy. The Ironborns are going to Ironborn. Bracken's turned on their own people. That's worse. So, and had she lived, like, she stood up to him and was executed for it. Had she lived, she would have seen that Lord Lothar was hanged in a crow cage to starve to death. So he got quite the karma for his actions there. And I think the Blackwoods would be like, yep, he agreed. He earned that and more, I think they'd be saying, after that horrible way their lady and her sons were killed.
What did King Harwin get? He's the one that seems should be getting some karmic justice too, but did he? He just
nope.
kept being king.
He just ruled the Riverlands and passed it on to his son. Yeah, he didn't really have any karmic justice for him. So, yeah, and that's an uncomfortable truth about war and conquest, is that it's often wildly profitable for the winning side. But that's a point that doesn't apply to Bracken and Blackwood. There's no profit really at the end of this for them. Like, if I wipe out the Brackens, I get... It's like the Underpants Gnomes. Like, there's no profit at the end of that. Like, the king won't let you keep Stonehead. If the Brackens take Blackwood Vale, the king will be like, you can't have that. We're giving it to a new house. Someone else gets to rule that. It won't be your ancient and arch enemies anymore. You can maybe feel good that you're the Bracken that finally wiped out the Blackwoods, but there's no actual benefit, like measurable benefit in that sense, other than maybe they'll never attack you again. There is always that, which again is the uncomfortable truth about the benefits of foreign conquest sometimes.
You would get that benefit with peace also. There's
yes.
a lot of benefit to peace.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. So it's an example of how no one wins in cycles of endless violence like this. In ancient times, it might have been possible for one of them to wipe out the other, but those days are gone. They no longer, if they ever had the strength to wipe each other out, Sean, we talked about that earlier, they don't anymore, right? Like, they don't now, and they don't even have the permission to start these wars. So when they do it, they're already breaking the law when they do it. They used to be able to do it legally, and it was still a bad idea. Now it's illegal and still a bad idea beyond being illegal. So lack of benefit, lack of, like, they just shooting each other in the foot, it's just so bad. But if we're going back to this time where we're currently focused on, before the Iron Throne was forged, right? Before there was someone over them going, no, you can't do that. After the Ironborn had ruled the Riverlands for 80 to 90 years. We'll fast forward to that. So not long before the conquest, only about 10, 20 years before the conquest, Harrenhal was 3/4 of the way done. Okay? So we're 30 years into Harren the Black's rule. He ruled for over 40. The Brackens and Blackwoods went to war again at this stage, and it went even stupider than it often does. It went further into the realm of self-inflicted damage. Quote,
a decade before Aegon's conquest, The Blackwoods and Brackens had entered into a new private war in their ancient feud. Previously, their ironborn overlords had largely ignored such conflicts amongst their vassals. Indeed, if the Iron Chronicle can be believed, Harwin Hardhand oft seemed to pit his bannermen against one another to keep them weak. But this time, the feuding disrupted the construction of Harrenhal, and that was enough reason for Harren the Black to deal with them harshly.
I wonder how exactly the war disrupted the construction, but whatever it was, it would have been stupid. Because that's the only thing Harren the Black cared about, was building this castle. Like, he was making slaves out of people, like tearing down werewoods, doing all sorts of awful things. Is clearly the only thing that mattered to him. You know, it was 30 years into this construction. You know, all of his attention was put into it. And they disrupted the construction of it somehow. I don't even know how. Like, maybe they destroyed some mine, started some fire. Who knows? Maybe a bunch of different things, cut off supply to this or that. I don't know. But it was...
Their soldiers might have been responsible for transporting some material. And
Sure.
Instead of doing that, they're all fighting a war. So now all these workers are standing around at Harrenhal without the right materials, and yeah.
Good. Another just great example in air quotes, of how blind their collective rage makes them. Like, they're so intent on hurting each other and then so unable to back down that they're, while being pretty aware of what's likely to happen to them. Like, Harren the Black is going to kick y'all's butts for this. And he's way more powerful than y'all. If you wanted to stand up to him, you'd need to do it together, not after weakening each other. It's just really, it's like a game of chicken. They're driving right at each other, you know, and they're both like, oh, I'm not turning. And they're just going to ram into each other. Like, neither of them backs off, or they're like, oh, I'm going to drive off this cliff to show you I can do it. And then actually drive off the cliff instead of stopping at the last second, you know? So the conquest, moving forward to the actual conquest. Aegon and his sisters took portions of what became the Crown Lands first, and moved on to the nearest kingdoms. Aegon took on Harren the Black himself, who was believed to be the strongest. So, you know, take on the strongest guy, prove yourself to be the new strongest guy. And of course, Balerion was a big part of that. The River Lords hated Harren, hated the Ironborn. Probably didn't love the idea of facing dragons either, so the decision was pretty easy. Let's see. We hate this guy. He's probably going to lose. Should we stick with him or not? You know, like, it's a pretty easy call. Let's switch to the guy with dragons who we don't hate. At least not yet. And he didn't, honestly, Aegon didn't really give them any reason to hate them. Not in the Riverlands anyway. Elsewhere, absolutely. But the Riverlands, they were like, yay, he's our liberator. Like, yes, he's also going to be our new king. But by comparison, he's so much better. And he raised a lot of Riverlords up. Like, a lot of them benefited from being these early defectors. So a lot of them were the first ones to join him because the rest of the conquest wasn't complete yet. He had the Crown Lands. His sisters were off subjugating the Stormlands and the Vale. He took care of Black Harren so fast. The Riverlords fell in line so quickly. Yeah, they were like the first ones. The Riverlords were like the first ones to join Aegon. And a lot of them benefited greatly. But because their private war and subsequent punishment by Harren the Black weakened them so much, neither Blackwood nor Bracken were able to take advantage of these new opportunities, this churn that had happened. It's this opportunity to rise in the court of this new grand conqueror, to be in his esteem, to get new jobs, honors, titles. That went to Edmund Tully because Tully had the strength to do so, whereas Bracken and Blackwood didn't because they were so weakened by that private feud and subsequent punishment. Remember that Edmund Tully was not only named Lord Paramount of the Trident over the Brackens and Blackwoods, both of whom were more powerful than the Tullys, then and now. Well, temporarily they were weaker then, but they recovered, within 10 to 20 years, had more money, more soldiers than the Tullys, both of them. So it was a wasted opportunity. Had they not fought each other, one of them could have been in Tully's place. They might have been fighting over which it was. That's a relatively easy guess to make, but still, the Tullys were weaker, but they got to jump to first place because of their own squabbling. And the evidence for this is supported later by how quite often Bracken and Blackwood were able to claim high places at court later on. We've got both of the hand. There's a hand of the King Bracken. There's a hand of the King Blackwood. Well, that's Bloodraven, but still that counts. And so this just goes to show that level of prestige, that the value of having been kings in the past gives them extra clout among the nobility. And but they squandered it from the early going.
No, I think Nina points this out here that it might have been like a blessing in disguise for Aegon too, to not have to choose between them. Like,
oh yeah,
you guys made it easy for me, because then he's kind of choosing sides of this quarrel. Like, I wonder, even if that hadn't happened, he might have still chosen Tully or someone else, so as to not have to take sides or re-inflame the conflict between those two. But they made it easy for him. So,
and he wasn't like Harren, where he wanted them to fight each other, but he did want them, the top house in each region, to be reliant on him, because their authority should come through him, so that they need to stay with him in order to keep it. Otherwise, they might rally their realm and fight him. So yeah, by putting the Tullys in a weaker house in charge, yeah, we've talked about this before. The same thing happened with the Tyrells, and to a lesser extent the Greyjoys. So yeah, it could absolutely have also been a reason for Aegon the Conqueror, like the prime example of what kind of laws he needs to make for his new vassals. Like, okay, well, we need to keep them from fighting each other too much. Bracken and Blackwood is probably the best example, or worst example, of how it can devolve. So we need to use them as the litmus test of how we govern. We can't allow these kind of private wars. So what do we do to them? How do we punish perpetrators of private war? What's the punishment? What's the policy? How do we enforce it, etc.? Bracken and Blackwood would probably be the chief examples. Like, well, if we can control those two, then we can probably control anyone. And that would be... But there might be other river lords like Edmund Tully, who knows them well. Hand of the King is in there, like, giving specific advice on how to, well, and my father dealt with them this way, or, well, not his father, because they weren't in charge of them. My father said this about Bracken and Blackwood and their feud, or whatever. And how Strong had Hands of the King in their Riverlands house. They would probably have experience with the Bracken and Blackwood feud too. Their house is just as old, so thousands of years of dealing with these houses as neighbors. Like, yeah, well, if you want to deal with those two, you got to do this or that. Don't give too much favor to one or the other. Aegon would be getting advice from riverlords, like, here's how you handle that. And then if you can handle that one, you can handle any other conflict. So, yeah, once again, they're the tip of the spear, the best example and the worst example.
They're like a long-standing problem, but at that moment for Aegon, the Iron Islands had a lot of infighting too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So had he conquered? Had they bowed to him at that point?
They didn't bow to him until the second year after the conquest. He kind of let them do their thing while he was conquering the other areas, while the Iron, and then he was like, time to go settle this and put it, because there was religious warring. The Shrike, or Lodos rather. Lodos was leading a religious rebellion against the dragons. And yep, it was bad. Speaking of the example of that Hoster Blackwood gave to Jaime of, we've had lots of pieces. We've had many times where Bracken and Blackwood married, and just, it was a temporary fix at most, and that happened here. Visenya brokered a double wedding between Bracken and Blackwood early after the conquest. We're not sure if it was, 10, 20, 30 years in, because it was during Aegon's reign, and he reigned till the year 36. So plenty of time for that to have happened, but either way, it also doesn't seem to have created any lasting peace, but it maybe worked for 50, 60 years. So decent job there by Visenya, but they may have also just been like afraid to test their new overlords. Even Bracken and Blackwood might have been like, Harren the Black can only do so much to us, but these guys have dragons. We saw what they did to literally to Harren the Black. They have Harrenhal sitting right there to remind them of what happened. So that might have helped keep them down for a while, but not forever. It came back, as it always does. And we'll come back after some quick messages here. We would love to have you join us on Patreon. That is the main source of income for us. It's what enables us to do this. And we try to make it worth your while. We've got lots of bonus episodes. We do polls, which lead to the choosing of episodes, so you can help us select episodes. We have our now yearly Topics Moot, which has happened only 1 year, but is going to be an annual thing. And yeah, it's my personal way of doing things. You've heard me say this before. I'll say it again. I think it's a good way to carry yourself. Whatever shows, podcasts, etc., that I consume the most personally, I find myself using the most. Those are the ones I contribute to. Maybe the top 5 or 10 or 15. As a podcast, History of Westeros supports a good 10 to 15 other podcasts. Occasionally we change it up. We're not rich. We got to support one show for a year, maybe move on to support another show for a year, and then you come back here and there. That's how we do it. it's worth a discussion here occasionally, because I think it's a new thing. The idea of direct supporting of certain creators or certain shows or whatever word you choose for that. It hasn't always been possible so easily. The internet and technology and the ease of money going back and forth has made that possible. So these discussions, I think, have some value, because I think a lot of us do it differently, and there is no necessarily correct way to do it. It really is a buffet style. Take what you want, leave what you don't want, but participate. And that's how I think about it. So this is my 2 cents. Historyofwesteros.com is also the place to go to link not just to our Patreon, but to a lot of other ways to support the show through affiliate links. But also, we have our episode sorter there. You can find any episode we've made through Ashea's excellent search tool. So that's handy. A lot of reasons to go to our website.
It's been a long time, but I think it's before I ever heard the word podcast. But Radiohead released an album for free. And they're like, yeah, you can pay us if you want. However much you like it, pay us that much money. I remember thinking, wow, that's a revolutionary idea.
Yeah, right? And, when you're a band as big as Radiohead, you can do stuff like that. But still, I'm not saying that as to be cynical. Because when they do that, it does put that idea out there for more people to do it. It encourages that. It is a rising tide lifts all boats type of situation, even though in this case it's just conceptual. It's like, yeah, support directly rather than, and we all like that, because who wants to support the music industry when you could support the artists? That's one of the worst industries there is, right? Podcast industry is fine. It's not the best ever, but it's nowhere. It doesn't have the decades of filth that the music industry has. It's just such a criminal industry. There's some good people.
We need to get started on now, Aziz. We need more filth.
Yeah, let's get in there. That's the industry for me. Yeah. Yeah. So we every Friday I do Twitch streaming over on twitch.com/historyofwesteros, and that involves playing the games Crusader Kings 3 with the A Song of Ice and Fire mod. So it is set in Westeros with Essos and all that good stuff. It's extremely detailed, and there's a group of you all who join me every week who I call the Large Council. Y'all help me make decisions and name characters, punny or otherwise. And right now we're playing House Tarly in the era of just after the Blackfire Rebellion, the final Blackfire Rebellion, the Nine Penny Kings War, and we had Robert's father's rebellion. That's right. Robert didn't exist in this timeline because it started in 258 before he was born. Robert's father, Stefan, instead rebelled against the queen, Rhaenyra Targaryen, not the same Rhaenyra as, Dance of the Dragons era, a different Rhaenyra, child of Aegon the Fifth. And so good times and fun happens every Friday with alternate world Game of Thrones. Let's get back to it. It's funny to think about Victarion and how Euron... Oh, no, that sentence, you can just stop right there. It's funny to think about Victarion. Yeah, just end of sentence. No, just kidding. It's funny to think about Victarion and how Euron got him to go halfway across the world simply by taunting him with the equivalent of, what, are you scared? Too scared to go across the world? I'm not scared of anything. I'll go across the world. That is the most manipulatable person. You are so talk about leaving yourself open. This guy can totally make you do whatever he wants if you're that easy.
Called me Yella.
Yeah. How so keep that in mind. One brother taunting the other and getting him into action. Blackwood taunting Bracken or back and forth or the other way around, vice versa. That's probably very effective because they hate each other so much. They have so little. They use so little of their brain when it comes to the opposite. They get worked up so easily. It's just that Bracken. It don't have to be true. Just someone like a Varys or a Littlefinger could be bro, that black one, black. I was doing it. I was doing so well not crossing Bracken and Blackwood names. Now I'm doing it. That Blackwood over there called you a name, bro. It's what? It doesn't have to be true. They'll probably believe it because that is what a Blackwood would do. Oh, you can't trust them. They're all treacherous. They're born with traitor's blood, like Jonas said. Yeah. So
I appreciate that. Was that Littlefinger and Varys you said?
Yeah.
These squirrely, manipulative characters. You can lump Tywin in with them also, right?
Oh yes, Tywin would do that. Yeah, he would do it. He would also do it to their faces, but he would also do it behind the scenes. Yeah, he would do both.
Did do it seems, right?
Oh yeah,
that later.
Yes, Tywin totally took advantage of this, of their hating each other. So after the conquest, this phase that we like to call Under the Dragons, and we have a couple of different episodes that are held that title, different houses or regions, and how the early phase of Under the Conquest treated them. The Brackens and Blackens weren't in a great position to take advantage of the great shift to power, as we said. They did so later, though, and that's as well in part due to proximity. They're former royal houses that are near King's Landing, relatively speaking. They're not as proximate as each other. They're not right next door, but still, the Riverlands, it's like 2 weeks, 3 weeks ride from their lands to King's Landing, which is pretty short comparatively. Things were pretty quiet for Blackwood and Bracken under Aegon, Aenys, and Maegor. And that might be because of that Visenya double marriage. That might have really worked for a couple generation or two. Or maybe they just were, like I said earlier, afraid of pissing off the dragons. Fair point, right? Like, this is Visenya and Aegon, and Rhaenys would have been dead pretty early on, but still. But the Brackens were busy with Maegor, thanks to his wars against the Faith. And the Blackwoods might have sat back and been like, see? Look what happens when you mess with, you take on the Seven like that. You become a Seven worshiper, and look what happens. You got to get in these wars and all that. Like, our religion is so much better. Bracken was also Kingsguard in this era, and he defected away from Maegor when Maegor's reign kind of collapsed. And yeah, I wonder if the Blackwoods were like, why would you have a Bracken in your Kingsguard? Like, how could you trust that guy? Like, he's just going to stab you in the back. And sure enough, like, that's probably what they said. Even though it was Maegor, he defected away from Maegor. Like, see, can't trust him. Even though it was a totally reasonable thing to do. Like, this is Maegor we're talking about. But Jaehaerys, who was obviously king next, didn't really want any Kingsguard who switched sides. And so he allowed this Oliver Bracken to switch his white cloak for a black one and join the Night's Watch. Now, this Oliver Bracken had more adventures in the north. Crazy stuff that happened up there, but they have nothing to do with any Blackwoods or the feud. But it's quite a story anyway, but we'll come back to that some other time. And
he wasn't exactly a hero, though. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh no, he was definitely not. Not even close. He was a bad guy.
When we were first putting this episode together, I asked you, are there any Brackens who are protagonistic, heroic, any kind of positive light? And you're like, I don't think so. And I'm like, yeah. Are there any Blackwoods who are like negative villain bad guys? I'm like, maybe Bloodraven. Sort of, yeah. It seems pretty clear that George is presenting them with a bias.
Yes, they are. Minimum, But it's interesting that despite that bias, none has triumphed over the other, Yeah. And I have more to say on that later as well.
Same. Yeah.
Yeah. So Visenya's double marriage didn't have, eventually it wore off, I guess, because things clearly flared back up near the end of the first century or so. We don't have the details, but here's a brief quote that tells the story.
Even the old king, Jaehaerys the Conciliator, failed in his attempt to halt this ceaseless war, for the peace he forged did not long outlast the end of his reign.
Yep, so they went right back at it. Even the man who earned the nickname the Conciliator, like, he was really good at this sort of thing. He made peace between the Faith and his house, like after what Maegor did, solved all that, brought a lot of other houses back into the fold that had wars with each other, just fixed a lot of simmering feuds, but he couldn't fix this one. To be fair, it had lasted a lot longer than the other ones that he was dealing with. But just goes to show. All right, the dance era. The Blackwoods supported Laenor in the Great Council of 101. Remember, the book version, it's Laenor, not Rhaenys. We don't know who the Brackens supported, but probably Viserys, because he was the most popular candidate by far, and the Blackwoods are noted as an exception to supporting Laenor. So almost certainly the Brackens were supported Viserys, who, of course, became king. 11 years later, in the year 112, so we're still 17 years before the war, a Samwell Blackwood dueled Sir Amos Bracken for Rhaenyra's favor. There's no indication Rhaenyra actually cared that much, but they said, hey, let us duel for your favor. And she's like, okay. Neither of them actually got anything out of it. Amos won the duel, but it didn't seem to win him any acclaim. In fact, the Brackens fought for the Greens later. So maybe they were expecting something and got nothing, and that's why they were like, all right, we're fighting for the Greens. But so a different version of this happened on TV. There's a different Bracken and Blackwood happened. For some reason, it happened in the Stormlands, but whatever. So that wasn't Samwell. It was, what was his name? Willem Blackwood versus Gerald Bracken. That works for me. Like, I don't know why they changed it from Samwell and Amos. But, like, there's been infinite Blackwoods that have fought infinite Bracken. So just, throw two names together and give them a reason to fight. And which this is. They're both trying to, I impress the girl more than you. And you can imagine the taunting, just like it happened in the TV show. One little taunt is really all it took to get going. And if those were two other houses, it might be like, that seems extreme, but Bracken and Blackwood? And I actually like how the TV show portrayed it, because right after young Willem kills Gerald, he like throws up. He can't believe what he just did. And it's like, that to me, that's the feud. That's their ancestors made that happen as much. They're just along for the ride. Like the kid doesn't even know what he's doing until he's like, oh my God, I just killed this guy, you know? So that's the power of this feud, just like coursing through his veins.
And once he's done that, it's going to be hard to choose a new path forward.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He kind of has to stand by that identity that he just created for himself, or that his parents created for him, or whatever. Yeah,
he's got to own it. He's like, yeah, I killed that Bracken. Even if he kind of feels guilty about it or feels bad about it, or like, nope. It's that whole better to look cruel than stupid kind of thing, you know. He's like, nope, I did that. So despite what he believes, he's going to say that he did it on purpose, and I took out a Bracken. That was a good thing, you know. Like I'm always going to be proud of that. Well, you know, why wouldn't I be? Blah blah blah. He may not actually feel that, but that's the party line, I think. So the Blackwood. Go ahead.
I just want to point out that I avoided research in this section because I don't want to spoil myself for the House of the Dragon show, you know, and I kind of trust you to not spoil me through here. But for example, I'm scared to even know what side the Brackens and Blackwoods fall on, because there seems to be such this bias toward the Blackwoods being more the good guys. Although that's not the same thing as being on the winning side. But anyway, I just want to throw that out there to the audience. And I'm trying to stay unsullied on this still.
If you want to take your headphones off for 3 minutes, this is the only brief spoilers we have. They're pretty mild, but, you know.
Can I message Sean on Facebook?
Yeah, just tell him when to come back.
Yeah,
let's do that.
Yeah, all right.
So the Blackwoods declared for the Blacks early in the war, as did most of the Riverlands. The Brackens took the side of the Greens, and though it isn't explicit, it might have been because they didn't want to be on the same side as the Blackwoods, which is obviously a foolish decision, making your choice based on which side your enemy is on. Like, you know, you should make a decision based on what's better for your house overall, not just what the Blackwoods are doing. And they certainly engaged in some fresh mutual destruction. You know, there was the Lord Blackwood was killed, and then Lord Bracken was killed, and mostly the Blackwoods got the better of it, but not because it was Blackwood versus Bracken, but because most of the Riverlands was on the side of the Blacks. So the Brackens were in the minority, and it didn't work out very well. Daemon was there. They didn't have a dragon on their side. So pretty quickly, the Brackens were not a factor in the war anymore. They lost, and they joined the rest of the Riverlands, but we don't actually hear them mentioned again. The Blackwoods are mentioned a lot throughout the rest of the war, but not in the context of fighting Brackens, so it's not too relevant for us today, except perhaps to say the Brackens probably were jealous. The Blackwoods were very outstanding. There are a lot of famous names: Black Alley Blackwood, Bloody Ben Blackwood, Red Rob Rivers even. That's a bastard of Raventree. So other than the fame and honor that Blackwoods gained that the Brackens didn't, that there's not much else to say about the dance. Yep. Now, it's certainly possible there was another flare-up after the dance, but we're getting into the era, which is after the dance, that is kind of hazy for us. There's fire and blood, but there's no blood and fire, meaning we have the years 1 through 131, 136 just pretty well known, but the period between after the dance up until roughly Robert's Rebellion-ish, maybe a little before that, we're missing a lot. You know, there's certain periods we know decently well because of Dunk and Egg, for example, but yeah, there's large chunks that are some of the least understood for us, and it looks likely that there was some Blackwood Bracken competition here and there, especially after the dance when there was no more threat of dragons, right? It's one thing for Bracken and Blackwood to rise up and get Aegon or Maegor or someone's attention, and Balerion, next thing you know, Balerian's there, burning one of their castles down. But after the dance, there's like no dragons left. So what do they have? Probably feel a little more empowered to do what they want and deal with the consequences later. Because they were already pretty willing to do that. It's like, well, we'll fight each other, and that's better than not fighting each other, even though the punishment will be great. But but it also shows how things transitioned. They started fighting. They moved, let's say, didn't start fighting, but they moved their theater of their feud to not just the Riverlands anymore. It started also happening at court. Bracken and Blackwood dynamics played out at the Red Keep as much as they played out in the Riverlands. This is an evolution of their feud, and it's fairly recent in the history. We've covered thousands of years of history today, but some of the stuff under the Targaryen reign is very different because it allows them to both simultaneously play out their ambitions both against each other and individually as houses under the auspices of the Iron Throne, where there's a lot of space to rise. Because, hey, the era of Blackwood and Bracken kings is gone. But there's nothing to say that a Bracken or Blackwood queen couldn't exist through marriage to a Targaryen, right? That's entirely possible. It wasn't as possible during the era of dragons because they were more set on the incestuous marriages because the blood of the dragon, making able to fly dragons and all that. But after the dance, the dragons were no longer the source of Targaryen power. They started to move towards the faith. They started to embrace the Seven as a means of power, as a means of authority, because to replace their draconic authority. Like, they had physical prowess with the dragons. They didn't have that anymore. So they're like, well, the gods chose us. We are the arbiters of heaven, in a sense. So everything goes through us, right? And that enabled non-incestuous marriages because the Targaryens are like, well, we don't care about that as much. Plus, we're also trying to be more under the rules of the faith, and the faith isn't so big on incest. Yes, we had the doctrine of exceptionalism, but the doctrine of exceptionalism specifically refers to dragons and things like that, which we don't have those anymore. So they kind of quietly started doing more quote-unquote regular marriages to just powerful houses rather than just to each other. And yes, Bracken and Blackwood were included in that, and in no era was that more a big deal, more prominent than under Aegon the Unworthy, who had his famous 9 mistresses and countless other lovers and flings and what have you, but there were 9 that had longevity. So really, here's an overview of the relevant parts. Aegon the Unworthy's 5th mistress was Barbara Bracken, who bore Aegor Rivers, who later became known as Bittersteel. Aegon the Unworthy's 6th mistress was Melissa Blackwood, who bore Brynden Rivers, who later became known as Bloodraven. There was also 2 sisters, Mia and Gwyneth, but we don't know anything about them, so we'll just have to skip them for now. Aegon the Unworthy's 7th mistress, so 5, 6, and 7, was Bethany Bracken, who was Barbara's younger sister and bore no children, but she suffered as much as anyone described in this episode. Poor Bethany Bracken. While others will leverage or incite the Bracken or Blackwood feud for gain as a strategy or whatever for their own purposes, Aegon just did it for fun, which is, that is his own purposes, but his own purposes were just kind of simple and kind of cynical, So when he was dating Barbara Bracken, he took the teats, which were currently in the possession of the Blackwoods, and just reassigned them to the Brackens. Like, nope, these belong to you now. Kind of inciting the old feud just on a whim. And then and part of this was because Barbara was well endowed in the chest, and he thought it was funny to be like, it's her family deserves these because she's buxom, yeah, again, this guy was a real piece of work. That's why he was the Unworthy. Although, well, just one example of why, anyway. then he breaks up with Barbara eventually and takes Melissa Blackwood as a lover. Probably in part to piss off the Brackens, just because this is the kind of thing he did. I mean, he could have had just about anybody he wanted. He was the king, but he took Melissa Blackwood and gave the teats back to the Blackwoods. He just like, nah, actually reverse that decision. It goes back to them. Just on a whim, just giving land to one family, taking it away, giving it back, blah, blah, blah. And all this was in the backdrop of a much bigger drama playing out at court over the years. Yeah. So we don't actually know who had the teats first. Just like the origin of the feud, we don't know who had the teats first, who took it from the other. But we don't know. But what's more important here is just this guy's being just a blatant, silly tyrant here. He's like, yeah, but this is land ownership is a big deal. It's held in trust. It's like an important part of their society, you know.
Think of the impact it has on the people that live there too. Like they just have no idea what to predict or plan for. Should we should we plant crops? Who is going to tax us? Are our houses safe from being taken over or attacked? You know, like, and to him, it's a whim that he thinks nothing about except 3 or 4 people that might get upset. But never mind the hundreds of people whose lives are at stake. You know?
Yeah, that's a great point, Sean. So, well, when he was dating Barba, when he had her as his mistress, dating's kind of a funny term to use in this context, but whatever. Lord Bracken was Aegon's hand. So he was basically taking advantage of the king's infinite lust by like bringing his daughter into the mix. Now, it's actually not clear what came first, the handship or the relationship. He may have leveraged their relationship to become hand or the other way around. Doesn't matter. Both of these things were regular occurrences on Aegon's court. He was the king of bathe her and bring her to me. You know, that was his thing. But Barbara was actually originally one of the companions at the Maiden Vault, one of the princesses in the tower. So that's probably where he met her. So it probably wasn't Lord Bracken being hand first then. But again, it doesn't really matter which happened first. It's a big parallel to Otto Hightower using Alicent to get in with Viserys. He was already hand, and then he brings his daughter in. Instead of Otto pushing Viserys to set Rhaenyra aside for his grandson, we have Lord Bracken encouraging the king's rivalry with his brother Aemon the Dragon Knight and his own queen, the sister wife Nerys, right? Remember, Aegon tried to disown his own son so he could maybe give the inheritance to one of his bastards, which is exactly what Lord Bracken would be pushing for, because one of those bastards was Bittersteel, who didn't have that nickname yet, but a Bracken being king was a reasonable possibility in this era, and they were certainly pushing for it. And Nerys had her illnesses, right? She was frail. The Maester's like, it's not a good idea for her to have more kids. Aegon didn't give a crap. He's like, I don't care. We're gonna give it a shot. You know, if she dies, she dies. I got more women. His attitude is like that, pretty awful. So he had also fathered Daemon Blackfire by this era, but of course Daemon was not Daemon Blackfire till he was 12. He was Daemon Waters, and the father wasn't known. Dana the Defiant refused to say. So that's why Aegor was more prominent in this era, even though he was a year younger than Daemon. But then Brynden Rivers comes along when Melissa gives birth, and that's 4 or 5 years later. I've long believed that Aegor and Daemon, who were both larger and older, now I don't think Daemon would have picked on Bloodraven, but Aegor would have. He's been taught, not only has he been taught to hate Blackwoods, but this is a particularly charged situation because Barba and Lord Bracken were very ambitious. They wanted to win Aegon over, get favors. Nerys, when she was dying, Lord Bracken started openly talking about the king marrying Barba after, in her place. Before she had died. Like, she didn't die until many years later. So it was really just uncouth, really just bad. Like, it's poor policy for his ambitions. Not a good way to accomplish his goals, his crappy goals. So he went too far that even Aegon had enough. You're gone. You're done. No more of this talk of setting my wife aside or replacing my wife. You're out. And then Melissa comes in. How
bad do you have to be for Aegon the Unworthy to think you're bad?
Yes. Yes. A very good point. Yes. Good observation. So you got to think that Bittersteel, who eventually poured poison in Daemon's ear, as we're told, had this poison poured in his ear first by his grandfather and mother, who were bitter, like he is, over losing their station, losing their relationship, losing his handship, all that, to a Blackwood. Right? Not just losing it, but losing it to a Blackwood. Like, oof. Like, that is the boiling point. That's all the things they hate stifled ambition, and Blackwoods. Like all that, right, mixed into a pot. And they can pour all that into this son, this promising, martial, violent boy who's really good at, has purple eyes. He's really good at fighting. It looks like he's going to be a real winner of a knight. Well, he might be not a winner, but he is certainly a knight and dangerous. And yeah, the other words are up to you on how to describe Bittersteel. I've got the shirt on, so I'm a fan as a character. Now, so remember this parallel. Think about how strong that parallel is. Like Otto was also fired for pushing the issue of succession too much, right? So you can kind of see, but this would have been different though, because like Viserys isn't Aegon the Unworthy. He's not. It wasn't a great king, but he also wasn't awful. It wasn't abject terrible. It wasn't just like constantly doing things to make it worse. And yes, Viserys left the realm in a sorry state vis-a-vis the succession, but it was through inaction, whereas Aegon did it specifically. He created the problem that wasn't there.
Yeah. Viserys made passive errors.
Yeah.
Aegon created problems.
Yes.
Created new problems. Yeah.
And these problems were created through the Bracken Blackwood feud. He used their focused hate as like a laser. Like that was the amplifier of this drama, was using the two houses who hated each other the most and just making a game of it. He's like, I'm going to pit them against each other and see what happens. And I get to sleep with whoever I want anyway. So what do I care? Yeah. So it's just this awful game. Like picture, this is what, like, imagine this is the kind of thing Joffrey would have done if he had lived to be older as a king. Probably with more violence, probably with Joffrey and less sex, but still pretty bad stuff.
This is the type of thing that makes us not want kings. This is the type of thing that led the world to favor democracy or whatever else.
Yeah. Because
when you have a good king, it's arguably better than a democracy. Even if you have a good, just, wise, intelligent, on and on, positive leader, they can maybe make a greater difference with greater power, but it's not worth it, because if they are,
inevitably someone won't be. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, they can just completely undo all the positives and be so awful for everyone.
Yeah. So it's there. We see a lot of this there, and so it's, instead of like most kings have had to deal with the Brackens and Blackwoods to figure out a way to calm them down, this king incited them. He took the thing that's a problem for rulers and made it worse for his amusement. Now, we're not sure why Melissa left or was set aside. Maybe Aegon just was like, I'm ready for a new mistress. I've had her for several years. I'm bored. But it could be like the Brackens were in his ear, hey, I've got another one for you. I've got a better, younger girl for you. Because that's what happened. The next mistress was Bethany Bracken, who we are explicitly told was groomed by her father and older sister, who had experience. Like, he likes it when you touch his this, or he likes it when you do this, or whisper this. Like, ugh. Like, it's so bad, but this is what happened. Like, she's teaching her younger sister how to, like, please this man. But she wasn't ambitious like her sister and father. She didn't like it. She wasn't in on the plan. And she, of course, eventually got caught sleeping with the Kingsguard and was executed horribly after watching the Kingsguard be executed horribly. And there was punishment and torture. And then Lord Bracken was executed as well. So it really backfired. It really backfired on the Brackens, trying to get in with the king here, and they're pushing back against the Blackwood element. I think might be a big part of what caused them to act too far. There was a line that they might have played around properly if it was just their ambition, but the hatred of Blackwoods and that element, like, it just threw a whole, just threw some chaos into the mix.
Gas on the fire.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, it was a catalyst for them to act stupidly. Like, oh, they might have kept their cool and stuck to their plan, but this Blackwood hate threw them off. Like, we got to also get the Blackwood. That became part of the ambition. Is, yes, we want power, but we want to use it against the Blackwoods, and we want to use it before we even have it all. Like, yes, make me king before the queen is even dead, or make my daughter queen before your queen is even dead. So just lots of mistakes. Like, you can't rise that high being stupid. But they definitely did stupid things to lose it, So it's like, yeah. Another example of both power and hatred just messing with your brain. When those two things are together, they can really mess with your brain. So the realm would suffer immensely, though. This was just the beginning, right? This is just laying the seeds for the Blackfire rebellions, which, again, the biggest great civil war since the Dance, one of the greatest civil wars in the history of Westeros. And I'm not sure it happens without Bracken and Blackwoods, without their feud. It's these mothers, really the Bracken mother that was pushing it more, and Aegon the Unworthy. But still, the Blackwoods are not blameless. They definitely get a big part of the blame for this next part. In general, they have an equal share of the blame, I would say. But here, maybe there's a case for it to be a little different. Still, like a virus that spreads from a rural area to an urban area where it wreaks havoc because there's a lot more people, the Bracken-Blackwood feud pushed itself onto a larger stage here with the Blackfyre rebellions. It started at King's Landing, then incubated back in the Riverlands. You got Barba and her father sent home, complaining and scheming all around young Aegor, who took all that in, and you could see how it affected him because he spent his whole life chasing the Iron Throne and fighting Blackwoods on a bigger stage than any Bracken before him ever had, probably. So this is the ultra competitive and ambitious lifestyle that he was brought into. And of course, we know that Aegon IV famously legitimized his bastards, and his son King Daeron was worried about what might happen. Right, the Blackfyre rebellions didn't kick off for 13 years after Aegon's, or 12 years after Aegon's death, and to maybe keep them at peace, he brought them closer together. He's like, okay, I'm going to bring you all to court, and you can be next to each other. I can keep an eye on you. That might have backfired, because it might have been inevitable, but it might not have, because Brynden and Aegor grew to hate each other. I mean, they already kind of did because they were primed to because of their families, right? So like they probably hated each other before they even met, probably, and they did meet as children. So a lot of these decisions would have been made for them. And then as they grew, the more and more hate would have been poured into their ears. Even if Melissa wasn't telling Brynden to hate Brackens or whatever, other Blackwoods probably did. Like she was an exception, not the rule. Like not all Blackwoods were as beloved and, amazingly able to make friends with people who should be her enemies. I wouldn't be surprised if Melissa came close to befriending Brackens, but even that didn't happen. But she did befriend Nerys and Prince Aemon, who, despite her lover being terrible to them. So I bring up Melissa's popularity to point to yet another thing that probably pissed off the Brackens. They're probably like, God, why is she getting so far? She's so they all think she's so nice and friendly and blah, blah, blah. Like, what is she ever? Blah. I hate it. She's... they would hate it. They would hate how popular she was.
You could argue that Maegor, obviously something like this isn't going to have just one simple cause.
Wait, Maegor? What do you mean? Aegor.
Well, when he... Okay. No, I mean, when Aegon the Unworthy legitimizes his son. Sorry.
Gotcha, okay.
That arguably created the Civil War, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if the sons that were legitimized had just been like Tullys and Mallisters, might not, right? Because it was Blackwoods and Brackens. I almost did the Brackwoods and Blackens.
Yeah, it's so hard not to do that.
It was this extra factor that stewed this pot into Civil War that might, it almost certainly was not going to happen if it wasn't for all Aegon the Unworthy's actions.
Yes.
But all Aegon's unworthy actions might not have done it if it wasn't for also the involvement of the Blackens and the Blackwoods and Brackens and their rivalry.
We're getting worse at saying it as the episode goes on, yeah. So, yeah, I agree with you because I think it's arguably the first Blackfyre rebellion would have happened anyway, maybe. But maybe not, because it was Bittersteel, we're told, is the one that just kept talking in Daemon's ear, pouring that poison in his ear, they say, that bitterness, which he got from his family, and so much of it was over this feud, or that the element of feud contained in this ambition. So maybe the first one still happens, but I think the continuation, second, third, fourth, maybe not the fifth, but of course the fifth wouldn't have happened without the second, third, and fourth, was because of Bittersteel's determination. Bittersteel is the reason that the rebellions kept happening. Without him, there is no... Maybe the second still happens, because Bittersteel wasn't even involved in that one. But the third, the fourth, probably not the fifth. Like, he's the reason, and it's his hatred of his brother and his loss of station and all these other things that was such a big part of it. Because they also competed over Shiera Seastar. And she liked pitting them against each other. She was kind of Aegon the Unworthy, and like, hee, I like it when you two fight over me. And, so... all these different things exacerbated their hate, and it played out over the Golden Company. Like, none of these things might not have happened without Bracken Blackwood feuding. Like you said, if it was Mallister and Tully, like, would this have gotten so charged? I don't think so. Maybe the first one, because Daemon Blackfyre isn't either. He's not a Bracken or a Blackwood, but he might not have rebelled without, at all. It's so interesting to think that the Bracken Blackwood feud might be a key element to the Blackfyre rebellions happening at all. There's a pretty strong case for it. And Bloodraven's attitude as a ruler, his ruthlessness, his hard line attitude, like a lot of us like the character and think he was a decent guy, but was too hard in some cases. But some of that's upbringing. He was raised in an era where there was Blackfyres everywhere. And you can't trust these Blackfyres. Like he speaks about Blackfyres the way that Jonas Bracken speaks about Blackwoods. You can't trust any Blackfyres. They're all treacherous. Like that, he pretty much does say that, or believes that. And some of his ruling decisions were made seem to like overly focus on what Bittersteel might do, even though there were like clearer, more present threats happening like on the mainland, like that he let those go because he was more concerned with what Bittersteel might do rather than what he was doing. So yeah, that's again and again, that's Bracken Blackwood is mixed into that. He doesn't just hate his brother because they're both Targaryens and because they fought on the opposite sides of a civil war and because of Shiera and all these other things. All of that was fueled by Bracken Blackwood hate. All of those things that's the underpinning to it all. That's the lowest level. Like it's the most anchoring of the hatred. It's the farthest back, out of all these things. So I think a lot of Bloodraven's ruthlessness comes from Bracken Blackwood feuding, right? Not just his experience as a ruler, not just the times he lived in, but those matter too. It's never just one thing, I don't think, with grand like personality traits and long-term decision making. Moving forward to the Hedge Knight era, Duncan Egg era, which of course still covers the era of the Blackfyre rebellions. 3 years prior to the Hedge Knight, the year 206, a fresh feud between Bracken and Blackwood breaks out because Sir Otho, the Brood of Bracken, slays Lord Quentyn Blackwood during a tourney at King's Landing in front of everybody at the capital where everyone's aware of it. This isn't some like small tournament off in a smaller house where maybe not everyone hears about it. This is kind of famous. This is going to travel. This is in a city with 500,000 people or so. Everyone's going to talk about it. Everyone already knows about the rivalry. Like, oh, it's going to pop off now. Those two are going to go at it again. Everybody knows Bracken and Blackwood are going to go at it. Dunk is aware of it. Dunk is a hedge knight. He's a 16-year-old hedge knight with no education, and he knows about their famous feud. It's specifically said. I mean, he probably was told about it by Sir Arlen of Pennytree, who that's relevant here. Now, Sir Otho's older brother would die during the Great Spring Sickness, which, by the way, was handled very unpopularly by the Blackwood Hand Bloodraven. So we had a Lord Bracken Hand under Aegon the Unworthy, and now a Blackwood Hand, 30 years later-ish. So Stefan Fossaway, of all people, one of the Fossaway Knight, one of the crappy one who turns on Dunk. He's musing about who they might get to fight on their side. This is, of course, before he switches sides. He's like, who can your 6 companions be? You should ask Brackens and Blackwoods, though you'll never get both of them on the same side. It's like, it comes up multiple times early in the Hedge Knight, the feud comes up. Then 2 years later, after the Hedge Knight, when we're in the Sworn Sword, Otho's father is dying. Right? So Otho's the heir and his father's dying. So everyone knows that Otho is going to become the Lord of Stonehenge. Septon Sefton says, oh, that's probably going to lead to war. Septon Sefton, sitting here stand fast, deep in the Reach, dealing with this issue between Dunk and Lady Weber and Eustace Osgrey, and he just throws out this bit about Blackwoods and Brackens are probably going to war soon. He's gossiping, and this is the thing that comes up. He also suggests Bloodraven's prejudice is a problem here. He's like, he never Brackens come to him and ask to speak to him, and he just won't see them. It's like, well, that's not a good way to rule. Like, their constituents, he still needs to deal with their issues, unless they're just coming to complain about some nonsense, that isn't a real issue. Maybe he's stonewalling them because they don't have a real complaint. It's hard to know what the real is. Is he being biased? Are they being biased? Or both? We don't know.
Sefton's probably a little biased towards the juicy gossip also.
Yes, I agree.
But,
yeah.
But still, when he wants to tell the juicy gossip, it's Blacken.
Gotcha again.
Blackwood is the juicy gossip he wants to get into.
Yeah. So it's great. So this brings us to the Village Hero, which might be the next Dunk and Egg story. right? It would be the fourth one. The war's not mentioned in the Mystery Night. So when the Mystery Night happens and there's no mention of whether the Brackens and Blackens actually went to war over this, it's possible that his father still hadn't died yet, though. We'll see.
I do want to point out, by the way, that the Maekar didn't become the brute of Targaryens, right? When he killed his own brother.
Yeah, that's true.
Whether there was something particular brutish that Otho did, or if it's just to push the rivalry more. But I think it is noteworthy that when someone's called the brute of whatever, they're probably not a good guy,
Yeah, that's actually a great point, Sean, because that's how that anecdote is mentioned at the beginning of the Hedge Knight, how Otho stove in Quentin Blackwood's helm with, I think, either a mace or a blunted axe, and that's pretty much what happened to Baelor with Maekar and his mace. So it is kind of like it was almost meant as foreshadowing in that sense, because it also started disputes. Like the death of Baelor caused a lot of problems, just like the death of Otho or death of Quentin Blackwood caused a lot of problems. So Nina has a great theory, or with some permutations, that this village hero story will be how we first of all meet Black Betha, Egg's future wife, and how it will involve Pennytree, the village that Dunk's former master is from. Pennytree sits between the Teats. It's the village that rests in that region, and it's probably traded back and forth many times. But no longer, because it's now a royal fief. Neither Bracken or Blackwood will ever fight over it again as long as it remains like that, because it's owned by the crown. Quite possibly because the crown was tired of them fighting. It was like, no, it's ours now. Neither of you can have it.
Who made that decision, by the way?
We're not sure. We don't know. Okay. But it was in this era. It was around. It might have been by Bloodraven. He might have, which that would have been a neutral decision, like that. Maybe because maybe he took it. He maybe took it from the Brackens and said, okay, now it's nobody's. But it would fit perfectly if that's what happened, something like that. If Bloodraven did it, or maybe the hand right before him, or something like that.
An interesting another little parallel anecdote with the Hatfields and McCoys is at one point there was a trial. I might be mixing up who was on what side, but I think that one of the McCoys was on trial for having murdered one of the Hatfields, and the judge was trying to keep things balanced. So he had the jury be 6 Hatfields and 6 McCoys. Except he was a Hatfield himself, so
oh God,
really keep that balance. But
and that makes sense here, because that's the problem here. Like, there's lots of people that will have Bracken or Blackwood or both blood, and in their recent family history, and it's like, well, you can't go that far without finding someone. It's hard to find someone that's completely neutral. Yeah. Right, like within the fandom, like most people favor Blackwoods, right? So that's just goes to show that most people would probably pick Blackwoods, and that's. Maybe in world they would too, or maybe at certain different times of history they might pick Bracken because of like religious reasons, like, oh, those Blackwoods worship the old gods, I prefer the Bracken, blah blah blah. Lots of different things where the bias would be almost straightforward, but the point is there would be bias, yeah. So Jaime and Hoster Blackwood spend the night at Pennytree. It's like they're talking about Bracken Blackwood conflict as they pass through the Teats, this most disputed of lands between them. And so that just kind of adds some fun to the whole scene, that they're actually in the zone of conflict while discussing the conflict, the history of it. And so Nina's idea is that Otho Bracken will marshal an army and take the Teats by force, and that will cause this to be a problem, and the people of Pennytree will be caught in the middle, and the reason Dunk will want to go there is because his master's from Pennytree, and he will want to help the people of Pennytree, and then Dunk will get eggs. Royal blood will be involved somehow, and who knows? But it's a great idea. Obviously, we don't know that. It's not like George has said this, but
yeah, it would be a great way for him to flesh out some of this history and still have this relatively simple story with Dunk and Egg compared to the expansive stories he's got in the main book series.
And again, to bring back what I said at the start of this section, his future wife is Betha Blackwood, and having them meet early on, like, rather than meeting later, because they fall in love. Like, they fall in love and get married, and it's like, yeah, okay, go ahead and get married, y'all. We don't care. You're so far down the line of succession. Blackwoods used to be kings. This is sufficiently prestigious, and we don't need it to be overly political. So yeah, go ahead. Of course, that changed, and the Brackens were probably very pissed about that. It's like, Blackwood Queen, damn it, we wanted that. But that's much later. And meanwhile, there's more Blackfire rebellioning happening after the village hero and before the village hero. Bloodraven and Bittersteel's feud plays out through the next several Blackfire rebellions, of course not counting the second, which we see through Dunk and Egg. Aegor Rivers decided not to participate with Daemon II's rebellion, but he fully supported the third rebellion, and that was a close-run thing. Aegor was captured, and Bloodraven wanted him executed. He's like, kill that guy. And the king was like, no, that's kinslaying. He's my kin as well. We'll send him to the wall. And then the probably exciting, daring commando raid where Bittersteel is rescued on the way to the wall. Like, what the hell? That's so awesome. But also, so, like, Bittersteel, Bloodraven was like, I told you to kill him. I said so. Like, see? That which just made him mad and made him suspect there were, or not suspect, but remind him that there were Blackfire spies at court that's how this commando raid was pulled off. Presumably they knew what ship it was. They had to have inside information to be able to do that. So, well, whatever Bloodraven's deal with the Brackens was, he didn't like extirpate them. He didn't have them like wiped out while he was hand of the king. So he might have been unfair to them, but he didn't like fully go like full blown like Mad King type stuff here. So this was just quite a thing for me. Like using this as a touchstone moment, as a key, as a most, maybe the best example of Bracken Blackwood outside of their own region is the Blackfire rebellions. But let's move on, because we have A Song of Ice and Fire to talk about. That's perhaps the juiciest part. In between A Song of Ice and Fire and the end of the Blackfire rebellions, sort of. The fifth one came after Summerhall. But Summerhall, big deal, right? That was a huge event. Would the Brackens have like quietly celebrated the death of all those Blackwood children? They were Targaryens also, but there was a lot of Blackwood Targaryens there that all died. And they might have been like, hee hee. we won't celebrate openly, but hee hee.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a question of if they would have quietly celebrated or not. It's a question of whether or not they would have celebrated quietly or not.
Yeah, they might not have. They've been like, yeah, it's party time. We want some, yeah, let's light some fires in honor of all those dead Blackwoods. Yeah. But on the other hand, Aerys became king, a couple years after Summerhall, because Jaehaerys II didn't live very long. And Rhaella was his sister, right? So they were children. They're still grandchildren of Betha Blackwood. And of course, Jaehaerys ruling for a couple years. That's his son with his sister wife. They were half Blackwood. So it still was a Blackwood king and queen right there for a minute. But they don't call themselves Blackwoods. Maybe the Brackens can kind of like pretend that's not the case. But yeah, let's move on to the actual Song of Ice and Fire thing. It comes up so often. At the beginning of this episode, we talked about how it's a weather vane or a wedge or like the key point of emphasis. You're going to see so many examples of that. If Bracken and Blackwood agree on something, it's a big deal. Everyone knows that the Brackens and Blackwoods hate each other. So everyone knows that if they agree on something, it must be meaningful. And because they prioritize their shared animosity so much, it can be used to undermine any alliance they're a part of. That's the wedge, the weather vane and the wedge, right? Tywin experienced it prior to A Song of Ice and Fire when he was hand. Because one time he ruled for the Blackwoods in some particular dispute over a mill. Of course, it's just some mill, some small piece of land. Thankfully, they didn't go to war over it, apparently. Tywin rules for the Blackwoods. But Aerys is like, nah, I'm giving it to the Blackwoods. Or to the Brackens. It's like, I'm just going to do that. Even though that's his grandparents, he didn't seem to care about that. He just wanted to overrule Tywin. That was his thing, so...
That's a pretty young rivalry there.
Yes, that's true. And it's a backdrop as well for a completely unrelated drama that happened around the same time. Hoster Tully was distracted the night that Peter and Catelyn and Lysa got drunk, and Peter thinks he slept with Catelyn, but actually slept with Lysa. We don't need to know what actually happened that night. That's a whole other story. What transpired with Catelyn and Lysa and how all that had such a big impact on the future of several Song of Ice and Fire plotlines. Why was Hoster distracted? Why did he go off in private, allowing the kids to drink because no one was supervising them? Because it was Lord Bracken and Lord Blackwood arguing, and it got to such a point where he had to take them in private because it was such a big argument, because these two just can't resolve their differences without the backdrop of thousands of years of feuding. And this is what Hoster Tully was having to deal with. So while they're off in their back room resolving this dispute, the kids get drunk and a Song of Ice and Fire groundwork is laid. Yep. Let's talk about...
That was a memory that Lysa was like talking to Sansa about.
Yeah. She was just like... She was just like trauma dumping, and Sansa's like, I wasn't born yet. Like, what? She's like, were you there when I was doing?
She's like, do you remember that? And Sansa's like, is she drunk or crazy?
It's like, I
wasn't born yet, man.
Yeah. Yeah. So but she specifically mentions Lord Blackwood and Lord Bracken with their dispute, which might have been Tytos and Jonos, but maybe not, because it was long enough ago that it might have been one of their fathers or something. Who knows? Either way, let's talk about the Kingdom of North and Rivers, which definitely involves Tytos and Jonos. George R. R. Martin has given us a substantial enough history that we can see patterns and concepts like history repeating itself multiple times. It's one of the values of having such a long history, is being able to show these things and see how they play out, and maybe show you, which also enables him to give you the occasional exception to these rules.
It also allows for cautionary tales.
Yeah.
Don't make the same mistake these other people made.
Yeah, and that's a very good point to raise for this particular topic. Prior to the Iron Throne, when the kingdoms were mostly separate, as we saw, the Riverlands was conquered in succession by the Stormlands and then the Ironborn. And before that, there had been no continuity over the eons, as different Riverlanders' houses had risen to the top, only to fall after a few hundred years or less. So again, I repeat the earlier point that the Riverlands hasn't had stability at the top like all the other regions have. And A Song of Ice and Fire brings us right into that cycle, with Robb forming the Kingdom of the North and Rivers. That's a kingdom that's never existed. This isn't rebuilding some old kingdom. There had never been a Kingdom of North and Rivers before. That was completely new.
There was rivers and hills at one point,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
this
definitely.
Is a new way to carve it up.
Yeah, so... we see this life cycle of a dynasty play out in kind of a short time. Like, there's only ever, at this point, we've only had one king of the North and Rivers, and that may not happen again. Maybe it will. Maybe it'll rise again by the end of the book. Maybe at the end of the series, that's what it'll be. It'll be the Kingdom of North and Rivers. We won't have any guarantee that it'll stay like that. We're not going to have a view into it's like 100 years after the books are over, probably. So like all those...
I'm holding out hope.
Yeah.
I'm holding out hope.
Me too. I'm right there with you, brother. Like all these other Riverlands kingdoms of old, Robb's didn't seem to last. It technically hasn't fallen, but it's not doing so well, is it? It's not. It's hanging on by a thread if it exists at all. I'm not sure you could say it still exists. And again, the Bracken Blackwood feud is at the heart of all this. Before, after, and during Robb's kingdom, I mean. When the Riverlands and Lords of the North meet after Ned's execution in Catelyn's final chapter in A Game of Thrones, she notes that Lord Jonas Bracken sits as far away from Lord Blackwood as possible. Quote,
Jason Mallister pointed out, let them bide their time, denying Lord Tywin fresh levies and provisions while they strengthened their defenses and rested their weary troops. Lord Blackwood would have none of it. They should finish the work they began in the Whispering Wood, march to Harrenhal and bring Roose Bolton's army down as well. What Blackwood urged, Bracken opposed, as ever. Lord Jonas Bracken rose to insist they ought pledge their fealty to King Renly, and move south to join their might to his.
Catelyn suggests pretty clearly that that's why he did it. Like, that's from her thought process. She immediately suspects his suggestion is because it's the opposite of what Bracken said. It might just be, a good idea that Bracken has that thinks it's totally valid. It might have nothing to do with what Blackwood, but everyone just assumes. And they might be right because it is such a common recurring thing. So, surprise, surprise, it plays out there. So their opposition is the wedge. Everyone, it sets the stage for Catelyn's musings and her internal monologue of, okay, these two are against each other. So when they agree on something, it drops the hammer of, oh, okay, this is something that they're together on after all this disagreement. Even they are together. So these are both valid ideas. Like, march to Harrenhal, bring Roose Summers down. Like, that's a valid strategy. Joining King Renly, that makes sense too. Like, Renly might treat them better. Like, they don't want to fight with Joffrey. That's the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They have no quarrel with King Renly, so why not make him an ally? These are valid strategic suggestions. So, like, it's hard to decide whether he's making that suggestion. So it just adds a lot of baggage. Their hatred of each other just adds baggage to this situation. We're like, well, is he saying that because he thinks it's a good idea, or is he saying it because it's the opposite of what this guy he hates is saying? So it's just it makes it all confusing. And so this is another example of just how the feud just throws things off. Are these allies worth it? Well, yeah, they are, but with caution.
Another thing is it makes either decision a little more difficult now because you're going to have one faction adamantly against it.
Yeah.
Whichever one of those options you choose, right?
Yeah. And if they make their case well, then a bunch of people will join them, and just on the strength of that argument, even though that the strength of that argument is more fueled by opposition to their rival than just good strategic sense. So their division corrupts everything around them. It infects decisions, ideas, support for those ideas, and who's motivated to have those ideas in the first place. Everything is questionable. Like, it just throws so many things off. Then Catelyn makes her move in this scene, this very powerful scene. She argues for peace. She's like, look, Ned won't come back. This war, it's not a great idea. Can we even win it? Blah, blah, blah. She makes her point. And the weather vane makes its appearance, and it's pointing directly away from her, because even Bracken and Blackwood disagree with her together. She's particularly horrified that they're both against her. She's like, oh God, I can't. That's it. I've lost. My argument is over. Bracken and Blackwood are against me together. That's it. She is their common enemy. Like, they rarely unite against a common enemy, but in this argument, she is that common enemy. And like, oh God, I've brought them together against me. That's it. I can't win this argument now. And indeed, she can't. Next thing you know, King in the North, right? Even Bracken and Blackwood are there, right? Slaying their swords side by side. Like, dang. Moving forward to the Battle of the Fords, George uses this device again. When Edmure is telling Catelyn his plan for the Battle of Fords, where he blocks Tywin's crossing, it comes up. Quote,
"The plan's a good one," he concluded. "Lord Tytos said so, and Lord Jonas as well. When did Blackwood and Bracken agree about anything that was not certain, I ask you?"
Be that as it may, she was suddenly weary. Perhaps she was wrong to oppose him.
The actual battle plan was good, it turns out. It just wasn't maybe the right idea to do it in the first place because of Robb's other plan, grander plan, which he didn't communicate very well. But whatever, that aside, it's neat to see here that the way that he convinces his sister is by saying Bracken and Blackwood agreed on it. He doesn't describe the merit. He's like, this is why it'll work. He's like, Bracken and Blackwood agreed on it. Boom. Right? Sealed.
You mean his mother? I think you said sister.
Oh, no, no, that's right. I meant sister. Edmure and Catelyn. Edmure, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, anyway. So that's a Clash of Kings, right? So that all happens at a Clash of Kings kind of near the end. And it works. He drives Tywin back, and by a storm of swords, Bracken and Blackwood are two of the 7 lords who help with Lord Hosser's funeral boat. So they're at the top, and as usual, they're mentioned side by side. The lords are named Bracken and Blackwood side by side, as usual.
I was thinking mother because I was thinking that was Robb and Catelyn, but that was Catelyn, right?
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and so yeah, she has this instinct to argue back, like, be that as it may. Oh, never mind.
I'll never argue you out of it if Bracken and Blackwood agree, you know.
She even considered that maybe it's even right if Blackwood, never mind my argument. Maybe they're just right.
It swayed her. Yeah, it's like, wow, even they agree, huh? Dang. So yeah, it carries a lot of weight when they agree. And that makes sense. Like, when two people hate each other that much, it does mean something when they can get over their hate to agree on something. It does sort of emphasize the point. And this is the literary device George has created by having this feud that's so charged. It's lends emphasis or credibility or what have you, weight to it being thrown around. It's really well done, really clever. I never thought about it as a literary device as much as it was. I just thought about it as world building, and I was like, it's both. George uses it so cleverly. It's both, and I'm not sure how much he's conscious of that. Like, because the more we've gotten to know George, he's just like a savant with some of these things. He just does it without thinking about it.
I've even had a little bit of a thought that it's, and I don't want it to be, it's going to sound negative at first, but I don't mean it to be, that it's a little unrealistic for this feud to have lasted so long.
Sure.
Right? For, especially when it has had breaks, like when, what was his name? The justice guy?
Justman,
yeah.
Benedict, yeah.
Like seemed to rally them together. And there's been these changing of guards and overlords and even just the natural, like, I don't know, diseases that come and go, passage. It seems like for this much time, even at Hatfields and McCoys, that only lasted like 50 years. It was,
yeah.
Like so it's crazy for a feud to have lasted this long for a million reasons, not just the feud itself, but just like the people to survive this amount of time. For houses to live this long is kind of unique, but to survive with the feud. But even if it is a little unrealistic, it's worth it for the literary device, for the storytelling elements that George gets out of this, that where this world building, like you said, or this device to let us know when these two people do agree, it's significant, or because they don't agree, everyone has to work around that. It really fleshes things out in a lot of ways that he couldn't do with the rivalry that was just one generation old.
Yeah, that wouldn't carry such weight. Like, he just like George turned the dial up to 11, like he does with a lot of things in order to give that weight to them.
Yeah.
Let's move forward to after the Red Wedding and start with a quote.
"The river lords are no fools," the queen argued. "Without the Northmen, they cannot hope to stand against the combined power of Highgarden, Casterly Rock, and Dorne. Surely they will choose submission rather than destruction."
"Most," agreed Lord Tywin. "River Run remains, but so long as Walder Frey holds Emir Tully hostage, the Blackfish dare not mount a threat. Jason Mallister and Tytos Blackwood will fight on for honor's sake, but the Frey can keep the Mallisters penned up at Seaguard, and with the right inducement, Jonas Bracken can be persuaded to change his allegiance and attack the Blackwoods."
Pretty specific, isn't he? He's not saying he could get them on his side. He's not saying he could get them to attack the Tullys or something. Only the Blackwoods. Like, I can get them. Their honor will not allow them to attack other River Lords, except the Blackwoods. That's the one exception that they'll make here because they hate them so much. The famous hatred is a wedge here. Tywin knows he can use it to neutralize both houses, turn them against each other, and then they're both out of the picture. And that's exactly what happens. Even though Tywin himself had Stonehenge burned early in the war. So the Brackens should hate the Lannisters more, but the Lannisters have all this power, and the Blackwood feud is so much older and so much more ingrained. So he's like, you know what? You can have a pardon if you attack the people you hate. And he's like, if I do that, like, this sounds like a bonus. Like, it sounds like you're offering me a good, like, I have to do that. Like, I want to do that. Like, thank you.
I'll pardon you if you jump in a briar patch. The briar patch, oh no.
Like, I'll pardon you if you go out and have a nice dinner with your friends. Like, what? Like, okay. Like, you're bribing me with a good time. Yeah, it's like, don't bribe me with a good time, man. That's exactly what this is. Yeah. So they stalemate each other for a while there because Bracken's like, yep, we'll get what few men we have left and go surround Raventree Hall and sit there and wait. Because, well, we'll see. In a minute, what's going to happen is the Blackwoods will refuse to surrender to the Brackens. Like, well, yeah, I'll surrender, but not to them. So it becomes a stalemate while they wait for some other resolution, which may or may not be coming. In the meantime, Brienne's over on the Quiet Isle. She wanders over there on her journeys, her searches. And Elder Brother says a lot of beautiful, tragic things. And one of them is that Bracken and Blackwood wash up here all the time. And they get buried side by side. Because in death, you know, there's no hatred there. They're all in the same place. They're just, you know, bodies. They're at rest. Their hatreds are gone. Their rivalries are gone. They probably aren't born Blackwood or Bracken. These are men that lived in those territories, not like people that actually belong to those families. So that feud was passed to them as well. All these like soldiers, which I think is pretty important. We focused on the families quite a lot, but all the villagers and commoners that they rule over are caught up in this feud too, and are taught to hate Bracken people living on Bracken land are taught to hate Blackwoods. Like, a lot of them probably do. They buy into the policy, the line. It's like sports rivalries. Like, you live in New York, you root for the Yankees. That means your family taught you to root for the Yankees, then you probably hate the Red Sox, or at least you see them as your main rivalry. Or, whatever sport your family follows, you're probably aware of this concept to some degree. Except this is violence. This is death and killing, not just let's score touchdowns or hit home runs or whatever. So, but some of the structural underpinnings are similar in that it's taught to you. You inherited this from your parents, and you don't exactly know why. Like, one sports team isn't better than the other morally, generally speaking, right? It's just, you just have a favorite, but you treat it like it's life or death or something more serious than that. In this case, it is more serious, but still.
On some level, it's maybe geographic too, especially when it comes to sports, right?
Yeah.
Like, you might end up being a fan of the home team wherever you're from, or wherever your parents are, if you move somewhere. But can you imagine someone being born in Barrowtown and growing up to hate the Blackwoods? You know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
Why in the world would they do that?
So let's talk about the Siege of Raventree, which is one of our last sections here. We're coming back to where we started, where Jaime goes there and talks to Jonas Bracken and gets his version of the history, and then talks to Hoster Blackwood and gets his version of the histories. And this is a little before that. This is how it gets started, which encourages Jaime to go there in the first place. Quote.
As the Riverlands took their leave, as the Riverlords took their leave, Lord Carl Vance lingered to say, Lord Jaime, you must go to Raventree. So long as it is Jonas at his gates, Tytos will never yield, but I know he will bend his knee for you. Jaime thanked him for his counsel.
100% accurate. Totally right. Like, yeah, that dude, the pride will not allow him to surrender to Jonas Bracken, but he'll totally do it to Jaime Lannister, like, in the name of the king. Everyone in the Riverlands knows this. This is a common knowledge. Like, Jaime might have known it himself. He might have needed to be reminded of it. And it's good for the reader to be reminded of it by this conversation coming. But, like, Jaime's like, oh, yeah, of course I do. That makes sense. They won't yield to their super ancient enemy that they hate with every fiber of their being. So I need to adjudicate. I need to be the ambassador, the arbitrator here. I mean, pride is already a big problem for the noble and privileged, right? Like, you're born with feeling like you're better than other people, and this feud is just as mad. This feud is as much a part of their identity as that nobility and that pride. In fact, it's all wrapped together. Noble identity, and their pride. Those two things are those things are linked. Your noble identity is linked to your pride, and your pride is in part to your house's traditions. And one of their traditions is hating the other. Now, here's how it plays out when Jaime is actually allowed inside Raventree Hall. Quote.
I am here to make an end of this. Your men have fought valiantly, but your war is lost. Are you prepared to yield?
To the king, not to Jonas Bracken.
I understand.
Yes, he does. And so do we. We do indeed. I think we understand. I don't know if we don't agree, but we understand. We've had a lot of education on this topic and of the way these people think. So yeah, let's return specifically to that conversation between Jaime and young bookish Hoster Blackwood, which comes very shortly after this agreement is made between Tytos and Jaime. Quote.
So you were fighting over a crown that one of you took from the other back when the Casterlys still held Casterly Rock. Is that the root of it? The crown of a kingdom that has not existed for thousands of years? He chuckled. So many years, so many wars, so many kings. You'd think someone would have made a peace.
Someone did, my lord. Many someones. We've had 100 pieces with the Brackens, many sealed with marriages. There's Blackwood blood in every Bracken, and Bracken blood in every Blackwood. The old king's peace lasted half a century. But then some fresh quarrel broke out, and the old wounds opened and began to bleed again. That's how it always happens, my father says. So long as men remember the wrongs done to their forebears, no peace will ever last. So we go on century after century, with us hating the Brackens and them hating us. My father says there will never be an end to it.
There could be.
How, my lord? The old wounds never heal, my father says.
My father has a saying too. Never wound a foe when you can kill him. Dead men don't claim vengeance.
Their sons do, said Hoster apologetically.
Exactly, right? We discussed this earlier in the episode. That is exactly what happens, and that's where their honor sometimes stops them maybe from what could end it, because it would be such a dishonorable ending, killing children. Not that continuing the violence is much more honorable, but you can understand why that would be a bridge too far even for this feud, which is, the worst feud that we can point to in this entire world. Now, Jaime's father, or Jaime himself, could have pointed out, well, if this conversation had gone any farther, which it didn't, because the Rains and Tarbecks were my father knew how to handle them, but Tywin was special, air quotes there. That was not something people normally did. Yeah, Aerys wiped out a few houses too. There are some, every once in a while someone gets exterminated, someone with power who's a lot more powerful than them does this. But these examples, when they happen, we're taught and shown through context that they're rare, and there's a reason why they're rare. It's just people just aren't willing to go this far. It's like theoretically anyone can murder anyone, right? But people don't, because they don't want to. It's too far. Like, this feud already pushes them beyond their normal human boundaries. Like, they already do things under the guise of this feud that they would never do in any other circumstance, save maybe a few really difficult enemy type scenarios. Like, you would almost never do certain dishonorable killings or attacks. Like, I would never attack. I would never be the first one to swing my sword at someone unless it was a Bracken. So they're already doing things that they would never normally do. And this is it. Like, Tywin was just one of those people that was willing to go that far. Like, his feuds with people were all win or die. Like, everything was play the Game of Thrones, you win or die. Everything is that way for Tywin. The Blackwoods and Brackens, maybe not quite that ruthless. Maybe just the fight, the feud is the purpose of it. That is the point. Not winning isn't the point. The point is feuding. To some degree, I think that's true.
There's also another factor to consider here, is that who's going to put Tywin in check when he does this.
Yeah, right.
Like, was he handed the king at that moment?
No, he was not. He was not yet. No.
But still, clearly, there's only really one person above him that can do anything about this.
Yeah.
And that person was insane and power hungry himself, or whatever. So another thing to consider is, there a couple of factors of this is kind of ironic when you think about that quote earlier where Jonas Bracken, talking to the Blackwoods, said, treachery runs in their blood. But now we're told that they've intermarried so much that they're the same blood. So he's saying treachery runs in his own blood, A.
Yeah.
If Jaime is suggesting that maybe you wipe all of them out, well, that means wipe all of yourself out too. Like, that, it's not quite the option that as dark as that statement might be. I think that Jaime was kind of implying when he said there could be, if you just kill them all, there won't be a rivalry anymore. But that means you have to kill everyone in your own house as well. So that's not really the option that Jaime thinks he might be presenting.
Yeah, I was just double checking about the Tywin being hand thing. He became hand right after the Rains and Tarbecks thing, basically. Anyway, yeah, well said, Sean. Basically just one or two more points here. I think we might see Hofstra the hostage again. Like, he's going to King's Landing, so like that's a place where we often you're more likely to be seen in POV chapters at King's Landing than most locations. It's obviously one of the most popular location for chapters to be, and that could go well or badly. Maybe he'll become a hostage for Aegon's camp instead, and then maybe Dany or something. Like, who knows? We could see a lot more of him. Maybe he will get to meet Tyrion. That would be interesting.
But that's Hoster Blackwood.
Yeah,
right? Is on his way. Isn't there also a Bracken?
Yes,
hostage?
There is. We haven't met her, but yes, one of the girls. Like, Jonas Bracken has a bunch of girls, and he said, I want you to send one of them. I forget if he picked a specific one. I think he just said send one of your girls as well.
But what I'm getting at here is another famous rivalry is the Montagues and the Capulets from Romeo and Juliet. And these two kids who maybe have not fully indoctrinated into this rivalry might meet and form a.
That's a great idea, Sean. I did not think of that. So maybe this young Bracken girl and Hoster Blackwood, who's like 12 or 13. Yeah, maybe they could become friends. Maybe they could fall in love.
Now, that also ended in tragedy, to be clear. So,
well, yeah,
how positive I can be about that potential, but
hopefully, maybe it'll be a good tragedy. Like it's changes the Blackwood Bracken dynamic forever, even though it doesn't go well for them. You know, maybe they die at King's Landing in a hail of fire, but everyone knows they were in love. Yeah. So Nina brings us back to the point about Bracken Blackwood favoritism and how both George and the fans, because of the way George wrote them, the Blackwoods are just better. The people like them more. And it's true. It's hard to it's pretty much impossible to disagree with that. Like Lothar Bracken betrayed Agnes Blackwood. You've got Cregan Stark, doing things with Blackwoods, and like you said, Sean, it's hard to find good examples of Brackens. You got Barbara and Bethany's a victim, and Barbara's a schemer. Aegor is a schemer and is as bitter as his name says. Tytos Blackwood, on the other hand, comes off so much better than Jonas Bracken. Jonas Bracken comes off as, kind of disloyal, kind of scummy, not the worst guy. The bar is pretty low in Westeros. Like he's no Gregor Clegane, but he's, he doesn't come off great. Tytos Blackwood comes off as honorable and upright, and he had conducted himself very well in the war before. He had stood out as a leader. He helped rescue Edmure, during some of the early battles when the war just started. So it's true. It's like, oh, that's true. Yet, I think it's super interesting that George doesn't make the Blackwoods the winner in the feud, nor does he make them more morally correct in the context of the feud. Outside the feud, yes, they're more upright. They're portrayed as better. They're closer to power and use power better in a lot of ways. They're kind of cooler, like Bloodraven's just cool, and their sigil is, I don't know, the horse is cool, but the Raven with the tree, that's just cooler, right? So most people are going to like that more, I think. But within the context of their feud, the Blackwoods don't look morally superior. It does not even drop the slightest hint that, yeah, actually, the Blackwoods are the ones in the right here. Not in terms of the feud. In terms of, like, yes, moral correctness, just general betterness, a better house, whatever. Sure. But in the context of fighting each other, neither looks good. They look equally to blame for it. I think that's neat. Like George is like, yeah, this house is cooler. I like them more. But when it comes to starting fights, I'm not going to give them any moral credit for that. They're just as bad. They're both equally to blame for this. And I appreciate that. That's cool. Like even in showing his blatant favoritism for the Blackwoods, they don't get set higher than the Brackens in the context of this feud.
It takes two to tango. Right? Like,
yeah.
Neither of them know the reason it started, but both of them continue it, even if one of them, aside from that, is, at least as far as we can tell, seems to be portrayed more positively. But if they were really good, they would not worry about the feud, right? It would be hard to last, very long if one side stopped caring. Yeah,
that's true. That's true. So will they unite against another common enemy? We saw examples of them doing that against the Andals, against not against the Ironborn, against the Teagues, for example, was another one, and perhaps against the others during the long night. And that might be who they unite against this time. Will that finally teach them to work together to set aside their feud? Probably not. It might. They might work together, but setting aside their feud, that's the part I'm. I don't know about that.
Together until the others are defeated, and now they're back to their feud. Right.
That seems more likely. Certainly in the short term it's going to happen, and we won't see the long term, so we won't know if 100 years. It will take time passing to know if the feud has stopped, because it's like, well, maybe they don't fight for 10 years. Nothing saying they won't start fighting in the 11th year. 100 years goes by, 101st year they might fight. So we would need a lot of beyond A Song of Ice and Fire time to see if they've actually stopped. Or the only way we'd know for sure is if, like, yeah, well, if one or both of those houses is gone, then that would be the end of it. So it's a great bit of world building that also serves as a narrative and or literary device to deliver emphasis. The Bracken Blackwood feud is more than I thought it would be when I started researching it and diving into it. I thought I knew where it would go, and in some places it did, but a lot of other things that came up that I didn't realize. I certainly didn't remember the part about it being the backdrop for Lysa and Littlefinger and Peter and all, or Littlefinger and Catelyn and all that night, that being the distraction that led to all the, I was like, man, even those little things. It comes up in social moments too. It isn't just wars that distract. It's just their disputes like distract people and or come up in other more mundane times that become not so mundane when after the passage of time.
Yeah, I thought this topic, I'm not unsullied like I was before, but I'm not as deep into it. I haven't read the book so many times. I've been doing this for a few years, not decades like some people, So to me, this was like, oh, a neat little niche part of the story we'll do a quick episode on. But just the superficial research is like, I think I searched a search of Ice and Fire for Blackwood and had like over 100 results. Like,
yeah,
man, how often does this come up? I just didn't realize how pervasive and consistent it was.
Right? It's cool. So it symbolizes the worst parts of human nature and human civilization. And maybe we'll see what it means to overcome all that and fight together. Maybe that will be part of this whole theme, this whole lesson, this whole aspect of the story. Trivia answer. What village rests between the grassy hills fought over by Bracken and Blackwood, known as the Teats? Pennytree.
Mentioned it several times.
Yeah, we did. Pennytree, there it is. Yeah, that's cool. I like that. So I'm sure we'll see Pennytree in the Dunk and Egg show. That's a guarantee. Like that's the guy. 100%. There's no way we won't see that. We might even see the pennies nailed to the tree. They might even do that. That'd be cool. I hope they do that. That'd be really neat. Although we won't see it in season 1, probably. Maybe we will if it's in flashback, because Dunk does have flashback. Anyway, that's a story for another time. Just looking forward to what's to come. There's always more to come. More episodes from us, more TV episodes, and hopefully some more books, too. Some episodes I mentioned that relate to this one. Under the Dragons is a big one. Before the Conquest is another one. Or rather, Before the Dragons is what we call that. Our Blackfire series. Of course, a lot of that came up, whether it's Aegon the Unworthy, whether it's Bittersteel, individual episodes for all these different characters. Also the Golden Company, a lot of the battles themselves. Of course, our Dunk and Egg series. We talk all 3 books are very relevant to Black and Blackwood feud, especially the first 2, but also the third one. Bittersteel and Bloodraven are always participating, and they're Bracken and Blackwood. So there you go. And of course, our Valar Morita series, meaning the books, the main series, we deal with these chapters individually. Jaime and Hoster and all that stuff at Raventree Hall and Stonehenge is very relevant. And various other places we've talked about him as well, too. So that's a good start for you. Hopefully you enjoy those. Aemon the Dragon Knight, by the way, that's another one, since we talk a lot about. He's important to the story of Aegon the Unworthy. And, of course, he comes up in the context of Jon's chapters very early on, both Daeron and Aemon and Aegon the Unworthy. So that's important. Also, the Shiera Seastar episode. There's so many that relate to this, honestly. We've been doing this a while, All right. Thanks, everybody, for attending or listening later. We appreciate you consuming our content because that's important to us, and we are grateful. Nina provided a lot of great takes today, as she so often does. It's a regular occurrence around these parts. Great takes from Nina. Check her out at goodqueenalley.tumblr.com. That's 1L in alley, as I like to say. Thanks to Joey, Jesse, Bran, and Michael Klarfeld for the intros and music that we have. We've got a new intro coming for House of the Dragon that's made by Bran. He's been showing us little pieces of it. We're getting excited for how cool it looks. And our regular video intro that will probably be iconic for us, at least for years to come, made by Michael Klarfeld. And, of course, we love our music, too, written by Joey Townsend. And a different version, the bluesy version sometimes you hear at the end of our episodes, is made by Jesse Koval. Until next time, thank you, everybody. And you know what to do. Valar, reread us.